Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation Bedtime History. Tonight you find yourself stepping into a world where the air bites a little sharper, where stone remembers footsteps that have not echoed for centuries, and where a lone medieval Falcon tower waits on the edge of the Scottish Highlands like it has been holding its breath for you. Snow is already drifting sideways in thin silver sheets, catching in your eyelashes, and you're not entirely sure whether the wind is guiding you forward or trying to turn you back. Either way, you keep walking. And honestly, you probably won't survive this in any modern comfort sense. But that is kind of the point tonight, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time in the comments, wherever you are in the world. And imagine for a moment that your weather is now this same restless Highland blizzard. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You arrive at the Highland Falcon Tower just as the sky begins to lose its colour. It is not dramatic at first, just a slow fading, like ink bleeding into water. The tower rises from a ridge of rock and frost, built from old grey stone that looks almost soft under the snow. In medieval times, structures like this were often placed on borders or remote estates, part of a wider network of lookout points and hunting stations used by nobles who treated falconry as both sport and status. That much is historically grounded, recorded in accounts from across Europe between roughly the 10th and 17th centuries. When trained birds of prey like peregrine falcons were prized almost like living weapons of prestige, you step closer, boots crunching into frozen grass, and you notice how the wind behaves differently here. It does not simply blow, it circles. It wraps around the tower as if it already knows the shape of it. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall a quirky medieval belief that falcons could see invisible truths in the world, that their sharp eyes were not just physical, but almost spiritual in nature. Some falconers even thought the hooting of a bird before flight did more than calm it, that it separated the creature from overwhelming visions. It sounds absurd now, but standing here, it feels almost understandable in a strange way. The entrance is a dark slit in the stone, half buried by drifting snow. You pause for a moment, listening. The highlands around you are silent in that heavy way that only winter storms can create, where sound feels like it is being absorbed rather than carried. There is also an old debate among historians about whether towers like this were primarily defensive or symbolic in these remote regions, and historians still argue whether certain Falcon towers were more about controlling land visually or about participating in elite hunting culture that reinforced political power. You push forward anyway. Inside, the air changes immediately. It is colder in a more controlled way, like the cold has structure here. Your footsteps echo in a narrow stone corridor, and you notice the faint scent of soot, old wood, and something like dried feathers. That detail is not imagination alone. Archaeological finds in similar medieval structures have uncovered feather fragments, leather straps, and tiny metal fittings used for bird harnesses, showing just how integrated falconry was into daily noble life. As your eyes adjust, you begin to make out the shape of the inner chamber. Stone walls curve upward into a rough ceiling, and there are narrow slits in the walls where light once entered, now mostly blocked by snow and ice. The wind outside presses against these gaps, and it creates a soft, almost vocal sound, not words, but close enough that your mind tries to interpret them anyway. You move deeper into the tower and find yourself thinking about how people once slept in places like this, not as visitors, but as residents, falconers, guards, servants, people who would have known the rhythm of storms like this intimately. They would have built routines around them, lighting candles early, securing birds in their perches, and settling into wool and straw bedding that barely kept the cold at bay. There is a small alcove ahead, and you instinctively step toward it. The space feels like a sleeping chamber. Straw is packed into a low frame that might once have been a bed. It is compressed now, hardened by time, but still recognizable. You imagine someone lying here centuries ago, listening to the same wind, wondering if the tower would hold through the night. You shift your weight slightly, and the floor answers with a soft groan. Stone always does that, as if it is reminding you that it is older than your understanding of time. In medieval Europe, falconry was not just recreation. It was deeply structured by social rank. Kings, lords, and even some wealthy merchants used different bird species to signal their status. A peregrine falcon might belong to nobility, while hawks of lesser perceived speed were associated with lower ranks. That hierarchy extended into the care of the birds themselves, with entire roles dedicated to training, feeding, and transporting them. You notice a carved ledge on the wall, and for a moment it looks like a perch. Empty now. Of course, but the shape is unmistakable. It triggers another strange thought. One that medieval people sometimes recorded in marginal notes of manuscripts. Some believed falcons could predict weather changes, becoming restless before storms. Modern science would explain this through pressure sensitivity and instinct, but in the past it fed into a wider sense that these birds were intermediaries between human life and the natural world. Outside. The blizzard tightens its grip. You can hear it more clearly now, a steady roar that presses against the stone like a living thing. Snow forces itself through tiny cracks, melting almost instantly when it touches warmer interior air, leaving thin trails of water that freeze again as they descend. You find yourself sitting on the edge of the straw bed, or what remains of it. The texture is rough, uneven, and you can feel how little separation there would have been between body and stone in this place. A cloak of wool would have been essential, layered thick, often reused and patched until it barely resembled its original form. There is a quiet comfort in imagining that survival here was routine rather than exceptional. People adapted. They always do. You let your gaze drift upward, where faint soot stains mark the ceiling. Smoke once gathered here, rising slowly from small hearths or torches. The fire itself would have been modest, fuel carefully rationed. Even that small heat would have felt like luxury. Some fringe interpretation suggests that falcon towers were not always purely practical, but also served ritual or symbolic roles in aristocratic identity. Almost like living monuments to control over nature, it is not universally accepted, but it adds another layer to how we understand these spaces. You lean back slightly, listening again to the wind. It changes pitch, and for a moment it sounds almost like distant wings beating against stone. Your mind knows it is only air moving through narrow channels, but your senses are less certain, and that uncertainty is what makes places like this linger in memory. The storm outside continues to build, and you realize you are no longer rushing to leave. The tower has a way of absorbing urgency, replacing it with slow attention, as if time itself has thickened around you. You are not quite sure when you start moving again, but suddenly you are back at the entrance of the tower, as if the stone itself has gently guided you outward without you fully noticing the transition. The corridor behind you feels quieter now, almost folded away, and ahead of you is the iron gate that marks the threshold between the sheltered interior and the raw Highland storm. The wind is louder here, not just present, but pressing. It squeezes through the gaps in your clothing and reminds you that medieval builders were constantly negotiating with weather rather than conquering it. You step closer to the gate, and the metal bars are cold enough that even the air around them seems sharper. Snow clings to the iron in uneven patches, forming delicate ridges that glimmer faintly in the low light. In medieval architecture across Britain and much of Europe, iron-reinforced gates like this were a major advancement in controlling access to important structures. Castles and fortified towers often used heavy wooden doors strengthened with iron bands or full iron grills, sometimes paired with a portcullis system that could be dropped quickly in times of threat. That historical detail is well documented in surviving fortress records and archaeological remains, especially from the 12th to 15th centuries when fortification design became increasingly sophisticated. You place your hand on the gate and push. It resists at first, not because it is locked, but because the wind is pressing from the other side like an impatient presence. Then it yields with a slow metallic groan that seems to echo farther than it should. The sound disappears into the blizzard outside, swallowed almost immediately. As you step through, the temperature drops in a way that feels less like degrees and more like intention. The Highlands open up around you, but they are no longer the gentle rolling shapes you saw earlier. Now everything is blurred, erased and rewritten by snow that moves sideways rather than down. The world beyond the gate is a shifting white curtain with no clear edge. You pause just outside the threshold, half sheltered, half exposed. This is where people in medieval times would have hesitated too. Guards, falconers, messengers. There are records of servants stationed at remote towers who described similar conditions, noting how sound became unreliable in storms, how distance lost meaning when wind carried nothing clearly. A quirky piece of medieval folklore comes to mind, one that appears in scattered regional beliefs rather than official doctrine. Some rural communities thought certain birds or even small animals like toads could predict storms by their behaviour, becoming restless before weather changed, while falcons were more scientifically observed in noble settings for their responsiveness to air pressure and movement. These folk interpretations existed alongside them, blending observation with superstition in a way that rarely stayed consistent. You step fully outside, the snow immediately tries to rewrite your shape. It presses against your shoulders, your face, your eyelids. Breathing becomes something you negotiate rather than simply do. The tower behind you is still visible, but only just. Its outline softened into a ghost of stone. This is where the tower reveals its true isolation. From within, it felt enclosed and stable. From outside, it looks like something temporarily resisting disappearance. You move a few steps away from the gate and look back at it. The iron bars are already beginning to gather more snow, as if the storm is attempting to seal it shut again. It makes you think of how medieval gates were not just physical barriers but psychological ones too, marking transitions between safety and exposure, order and uncertainty. Historians still argue whether remote Falcon towers like this were primarily defensive structures adapted for hunting use, or whether they were built specifically for falconry with only symbolic defensive capability added later. The evidence is mixed, with some towers showing clear fortification features, while others appear more ceremonial in design. You turn your attention outward again, toward the Highlands. There is no clear horizon anymore, just layers of white and grey shifting into each other. The wind carries a constant low sound, like something breathing through vast distance. It is easy to imagine how medieval travellers described such weather as a living force rather than a natural system. In chronicles from the period, storms are often described with emotional language, as if they had intent. You begin to walk slowly along the base of the tower. Each step sinks slightly, and the snow responds with a soft collapse that is immediately filled again by drifting wind. The tower looms above you, its upper levels disappearing into swirling white. You notice narrow slits in the stone, arrow loops designed for observation or defense. They look almost like closed eyes now, inside one of those slits. Faint movement of snow creates the illusion of something watching you. You know logically it is only wind patterns, but the feeling lingers anyway. Another historical detail surfaces as you continue along the wall. Falconry equipment from the medieval period often included leather jesses, small hoods for calming birds, and finely crafted perches that could be transported between residences. Nobles sometimes travelled with their birds in elaborate carriers, treating them as companions of stores. That practice is well recorded in court inventories and illuminated manuscripts. You imagine those birds perched somewhere inside the tower now, even though you know it is empty. A strange fringe interpretation you once read about suggests that Falcon towers were sometimes aligned intentionally with migratory bird paths, almost like early attempts at environmental synchronization. It is not widely accepted, but it persists in speculative discussions because certain towers do appear in patterns that loosely correspond with known migration routes. You stop for a moment and look up. Snow falls directly into your face now, melting instantly before reforming as frost on your lashes. The sensation is disorienting but also strangely calming, as if the storm is insisting on your full attention. The tower creaks faintly, not from wood, but from stone settling under thermal stress. It is a subtle sound, easily missed, but once you notice it, it becomes part of the rhythm of the place. You think about the people who once stood here in conditions like this, not as visitors, but as workers whose daily survival depended on understanding wind, fire, and animal behaviour. They would have known how to read subtle changes in weather long before instruments existed, relying on accumulated experience passed down through generations. A faint path circles the tower, partially buried. You follow it instinctively, each step bringing you closer to the lee side where the wind lessens slightly. Even here, though, the storm is never absent. It simply changes its intensity, like a living thing shifting its attention. As you walk, the snow briefly clears in a thin gust, and for a moment you see the surrounding highlands stretch farther than expected. Rolling shapes of land vanish into white distance, and the sense of scale becomes almost unsettling. It feels less like a landscape and more like a vast empty memory. The tower stands at the centre of it, stubborn and still, and you realise that standing outside it, exposed to the storm, changes your understanding of what it meant to live here. The interior was not just shelter, it was a negotiation with survival itself, a fragile agreement between human construction and natural force. The wind rises again, pushing you slightly sideways, and you instinctively step closer to the stone. It is warmer here, or at least less cruel, and you find yourself resting a hand against it as if it might offer orientation. The surface is rough, cold but steady, and in that steadiness, the storm feels briefly less infinite. You step back inside the tower without quite remembering deciding to do so. One moment you are outside with the blizzard pressing against your shoulders, and the next you are within stone again, as if the building has quietly accepted you back into its slow breathing. The iron gate settles behind you with a low sound, and the storm becomes distant, like a memory pressed against thick glass. The interior is dimmer now than before, but not entirely dark. Candles have been lit somewhere ahead, and their light is small but persistent, flickering in ways that make the stone walls seem to shift slightly when you're not directly looking at them. The air is warmer here, though warmth is a generous word. It is more accurate to say it is less hostile. You move forward into a chamber that opens wider than the corridor. The ceiling arches upward in rough curves, blackened in places by old smoke. This is the kind of space that would have been used for shared activity in medieval times, perhaps for preparing equipment or resting between long periods of labour. In many documented Highland and broader European structures, central stone chambers like this often served multiple purposes depending on need, especially in remote outposts where specialisation of rooms was a luxury. Candlelight reveals uneven tables carved from thick wood. On them sit stubby wax shapes, some new, some melted down almost to nothing. In medieval Europe, candles were commonly made from tallow rendered from animal fat, which produced a strong smell and a smoky flame, while wealthier households and ecclesiastical spaces often used beeswax candles that burned cleaner and were more expensive. That difference in materials is well recorded in historical inventories and monastic accounts, especially from the 12th century onward when candle production became more organised. You notice how the light behaves differently here compared to modern expectations. It does not fully illuminate the room. Instead, it creates zones of visibility and uncertainty. Everything outside the candle halos becomes suggestion rather than detail. You take a few steps deeper into the chamber. There are sleeping arrangements here too, simpler than the straw bed you saw earlier. Low platforms covered in rough wool blankets, folded unevenly as if someone had risen quickly or never fully settled. The wool is thick, coarse, and slightly damp from the surrounding air. You imagine how essential such materials would have been in a place like this, where insulation was less about comfort and more about survival. A mainstream historical fact emerges in your mind as you look at the arrangement. Medieval sleeping practices often involved communal or semi-communal spaces, especially in castles and towers where heat retention mattered. People would sleep in shared rooms or clustered arrangements, not only for warmth but also for protection. Individual bedrooms were a later development for many social classes. The candle flame closest to you flickers harder than the others, and for a moment it leans sharply to one side. There is a quirky medieval belief that candle flames could reflect unseen presences or even foreshadow changes in fortune. Some household traditions treated unusual flame behaviour as an omen, though this varied widely across regions and periods. Of course, modern understanding attributes such movement to airflow, especially in old stone structures where drafts are constant and unpredictable. Still, the flicker makes you glance over your shoulder instinctively. The chamber is empty, but not silent. Stone always carries sound differently, and here it feels as if the walls are holding on to echoes that never fully left. You hear the wind outside as a low, distant pressure rather than a direct sound inside. There is only the subtle hiss of burning wick and the occasional soft pop of wax shifting in heat. You move toward one of the tables. On it, there are faint traces of use, scratches in the wood, dark stains that could be oil or simply age, and a small carved groove that might have held a tool or candle holder. In Falcon-related households, it was common to keep specialized tools for bird care in such spaces, including small knives for leatherwork and hooks for adjusting straps. Falcons required constant maintenance of their equipment, and medieval manuals describe this process with surprising precision, especially in aristocratic settings, where falconry was highly formalized. You run your fingers just above the surface without touching it. There is a sense here of layered time, not one period sitting on another cleanly, but overlapping habits, repeated actions, and forgotten routines that still shape the space. Historians still argue whether Falcon towers like this one were primarily designed as seasonal residences for hunting parties or whether they functioned year-round as semi-permanent administrative posts tied to land management. The evidence varies depending on region and surviving records, leaving interpretation open. A faint draft moves through the room, and the candles respond together, leaning in the same direction for a brief moment before returning upright. It feels almost coordinated, as if the room itself is breathing slowly. You shift your attention toward the far end of the chamber. There, partially obscured by shadow, is a recessed alcove. Inside it sits what looks like a larger hearth, though it is not burning strongly now. Only a few embers remain, glowing faintly like buried memory. In medieval households, hearths were central not just for cooking, but for warmth, light, and social gathering, even in fortified towers. Maintaining a fire required careful management of fuel resources, especially during long winters in the Highlands where wood could become scarce. You imagined someone kneeling here hours earlier, feeding the fire with measured patience, listening to the same storm you heard outside. Another detail emerges as you look around the chamber. Carved into one of the stone pillars is a faint symbol, worn almost smooth. It could be decorative, or it could mark ownership or function. Some fringe interpretations suggest that certain medieval towers incorporated symbolic carvings linked to protective rituals, blending Christian iconography with older local tradition. These ideas are not universally accepted, but they persist in discussions of rural Highland architecture because written records are often incomplete or missing entirely. You take a slow step closer to the hearth. The warmth is barely noticeable now, but it is still there, just enough to remind you that fire once lived here more fully. For a moment, you imagine the rhythm of this place during a storm like the one outside, people moving quietly, checking locks, tending birds in adjacent spaces, adjusting cloaks, listening for changes in wind direction through narrow slits in the walls. The tower would not have been still then. It would have been attentive, almost alert. A soft sound draws your attention back toward the centre of the chamber. It is nothing distinct, just the settling of stone or the shift of air through unseen gaps. Yet in this environment, even small sounds become meaningful. You notice how your own breathing feels louder now, more present. It blends with the candle hiss and the distant wind until it is no longer clearly separate from the buildings itself. You sit on the edge of one of the low sleeping platforms. The wool beneath you compresses slightly, and the sensation is grounding. Not comfortable exactly, but stable. You understand in a quiet way how medieval people would have learned to accept discomfort as background rather than interruption. The candle nearest you dips again, and this time the flame steadies in a new position, pointing gently toward the hearth. You watch it for a moment longer than necessary, then let your gaze drift across the chamber. Everything here is reduced to essentials: light, heat, shelter, and sound, and in that reduction, there is a strange kind of clarity. Outside, the blizzard continues to press against the tower, but inside this chamber, time feels slower, almost pulled in place. You realize that if you stayed here long enough, the difference between storm and silence might begin to blur entirely. The candlelight continues to flicker, patient and small, holding the room together one breath at a time. You leave the candle-lit chamber behind and follow a narrow passage that seems to tighten the deeper you go, as if the tower is gently pressing its memories into smaller and smaller spaces. The air changes again. It becomes drier here, carrying a faint scent of old wood that has absorbed centuries of smoke, oil, and wool. A low staircase appears ahead, spiralling upward in uneven steps. Each one is worn in the centre, smoothed by countless feet that once moved with purpose rather than hesitation. You place your hand against the stone wall as you climb, and it is cold enough that the sensation travels through your palm and into your wrist like a quiet signal. In medieval fortified structures across Europe, spiral staircases were commonly built clockwise going upward. This design gave defenders an advantage if intruders climbed them. Restricting sword movement. That architectural detail is well documented in surviving castles and towers from the Norman period onward, and it reflects how even movement inside buildings was shaped by conflict and defense needs. As you continue upward, the sounds from below fade. The storm outside is still present, but it feels farther away now, as if the tower has layered its status between you and the world. The staircase opens into a low-ceilinged loft. This space is immediately different from the chamber below. It is smaller, more enclosed, and shaped in a way that forces you to lower your head slightly. Wooden beams cross overhead, darkened by age and smoke, and between them are narrow gaps where faint grey light leaks in from the storm outside. You realise almost instantly that this must have been sleeping quarters for those who worked most closely with the Falcons. The floor is uneven wood laid over stone, and it creaks softly when you step forward. The sound is not loud, but it feels amplified by the tightness of the space. Along one side of the room are narrow sleeping pallets, each no more than a raised platform covered in thick, worn fabric. Wool dominates everything here, not for comfort, but for survival against persistent cold that seeps through stone no matter how thick the walls. Medieval falconers occupied a unique position in noble households. They were not peasants, yet they were not fully part of the aristocracy either. They often held specialised roles, sometimes travelling with nobles to manage birds used for hunting. Falconry itself was a deeply embedded practice among European elites from roughly the early Middle Ages through the Renaissance. Especially valued in courts where displaying control over trained predators symbolised power and refinement. You move closer to one of the pallets and notice small indentations in the wood beside it. They look like they were made by repeated placement of objects, perhaps equipment or resting gear for birds. A faint memory of feathers seems almost embedded in the space, though nothing visible remains. There is a curious note found in some medieval estate records describing how falconers often developed strong emotional bonds with their birds, sometimes treating them with more care than other animals in the household. These accounts are not consistent across regions, but they suggest a relationship that went beyond simple utility in certain contexts. You sit briefly on the edge of a pallet, it dips slightly under your weight, and the sound it makes is soft but aged, like a memory being disturbed. The fabric covering it is rough, almost brittle in places, yet still layered thick enough to suggest how seriously insulation was taken in such cold environments. A faint draught moves through the loft, slipping between the beams overhead. It creates a gentle shifting sound, like distant fabric moving in darkness. For a moment, it almost feels like something passing just out of sight. But when you look up, there is only stone and shadow. Along the far wall, you notice wooden supports protruding at regular intervals. These are perches. Even without birds present, their purpose is unmistakable. They extend outward like quiet branches, some reinforced with leather bindings that have long since stiffened. In medieval falconry manuals, detailed instructions were given for training birds to return to perches reliably, often using food rewards and hooding techniques to calm them during transport. Those manuals survive in various illuminated manuscripts and written treatises from across Europe, showing just how formalised the practice became. You imagine the room in use, not empty but alive with movement, birds shifting their weight, soft rustle of feathers, leather straps being adjusted, quiet instructions spoken in controlled voices. The loft would have been both workspace and sleeping area, a place where human and animal routines overlapped closely. A lesser-known detail from archaeological interpretations of falconry sites suggests that some perches were arranged according to hierarchy of birds, with the most prized falcons placed in positions of prominence within the room, while not universally proven. This idea appears in several site reconstructions and continues to influence how some researchers interpret spatial organization in elite hunting spaces. You stand again and move slowly toward the center of the loft. The ceiling feels lower here, almost pressing downward, and you become aware of how carefully this space was designed for function rather than comfort. Everything is compact, efficient, and shaped by necessity. A flicker of light from below filters through a crack in the floorboards. It moves slightly with the wind, creating shifting patterns that briefly illuminate dust in the air. Those particles drift like slow snowfall inside the room. You pause and listen. The storm outside is louder again at this height. Wind strikes the upper walls with a sharper edge, and the tower responds with a faint, steady creak. It is not a sound of weakness, but of adaptation, like something enduring pressure rather than resisting it. There is an ongoing debate among scholars about whether spaces like this were primarily residential for falconers, or whether they functioned more as temporary operational quarters during hunting seasons, with staff rotating frequently rather than living a year round. The architectural evidence can be interpreted in both directions depending on regional context. You glance toward one of the narrow slits in the wall. Through it, the Highlands are barely visible, only motionless white, layered in shifting opacity. The world outside feels distant, almost abstract, like it belongs to another version of reality. for a moment. You imagine a falcon returning through that same opening, wings folding tightly as it lands on a perch, its handler already reaching forward with practiced precision. That image lingers in the air of the room even though nothing moves now. A soft sound breaks the stillness. It is subtle, like wood adjusting under pressure or a beam responding to wind. You turn slightly, but there's nothing new to see, only the same loft, the same perches, the same quiet accumulation of time, and yet the space feels occupied in a way that is difficult to define, not by presence but by residue. You take one last look across the loft. The pallets, the beams, the perches, all arranged with quiet purpose. A place designed around living things that once moved with extraordinary speed and precision, now reduced to stillness and memory. You begin to move back toward the staircase, each step careful on the uneven boards. Behind you, the loft remains unchanged, holding its silence in the same way it has for centuries, as if waiting without expectation. You descend the spiral staircase slowly, and the loft above you begins to fold away into quieter darkness with every step. The worn stone beneath your feet feels familiar now, almost patient, as if it has accepted your presence without question. The air shifts again as you move downward, carrying with it a faint return of smoke, wax, and cold stone that never fully disappears in a place like this. The sound of the blizzard grows louder in subtle increments, not because you are closer to it, but because the tower is becoming more open again. Stone does not silence weather completely. It simply edits it into something softer, more distant, like a memory of sound rather than sound itself. You reach a landing where the staircase opens into a narrow corridor lined with slit windows. These openings are thin vertical cuts in the wall, designed to allow light and observation while keeping structural strength intact. This feature appears in many medieval defensive buildings across Britain and continental Europe, especially from the 11th century onward, when fortified design began to prioritize both visibility and protection. Through one of these slits, you catch a glimpse of the Highlands again. It's not a clear view. The storm has turned the landscape into a shifting white gradient, where distance dissolves almost immediately after forming. You press a little closer, and the cold from the stone seeps into your forehead and fingertips at the same time. A mainstream historical observation about such openings is that they were never purely visual tools. They were also psychological boundaries. Standing near them meant existing in a liminal space between safety and exposure, which shaped how people in medieval towers experienced storms, conflict, and even daily routines. That sense of threshold living is well documented in studies of fortified architecture and monastic isolation practices. You move along the corridor. The walls here are marked with faint discolorations, darker patches where smoke has risen and settled over years of fires burning in lower rooms. These traces are not decorative. They are residue from countless nights of survival in harsh conditions, especially during long Highland winters when wind could trap people indoors for days at a time. At one point, you notice a shallow alcove carved into the stone. Inside it is a faded wooden shelf. On it rests nothing now, but the shape suggests it once held tools or provisions. In medieval households, especially in remote towers, storage was carefully distributed throughout the structure to ensure that essential items were never isolated in a single vulnerable area. You run your fingers just above the shelf without touching it. The wood has a dryness that seems to absorb sound. Even your movement feels quieter here. A lesser-known detail from historical inventories of noble households mentions that falconry equipment often had dedicated storage spaces separate from general household goods. This separation reflected the specialized status of the practice, which required constant readiness for travel or hunting. The organization of such spaces varied widely across regions and estates, making it difficult to generalize a single system. You continue forward until the corridor widens slightly. Here, The architecture changes again, the ceiling lifts a little, and the stonework becomes more uneven, suggesting this part of the tower may have been modified over time. Many medieval structures evolved gradually rather than being built in a single phase, with additions reflecting changing needs of occupation, defense, or prestige. You stop briefly. There is a sound coming from somewhere deeper inside the tower. It is not distinct, but it is present enough that your attention sharpens. It could be wind moving through unseen gaps, or the natural settling of stone responding to temperature shifts. In some older accounts of remote towers, occupants described hearing similar ambiguous sounds during storms, often interpreting them through the lens of local belief systems. Some communities believed such noises were the building itself reacting to human presence, almost like a slow awareness embedded in architecture. That idea is not supported by modern science, but it remains a recurring theme in folklore studies of isolated structures. You take a few more steps. The corridor leads you toward a larger vertical space where the tower opens slightly upward again. Light from above filters in weakly, filtered through snow and cloud, creating a pale glow that barely defines shape. You realize you are near the central spine of the tower. Looking up, you can see the interior structure rising in layers, beams and stone rings stacked like geological memory. The height is more impressive from inside than outside, because you can feel how each level supports the next, how weight is distributed and contained. A mainstream architectural fact about towers like this is that their stability often depended on inward tapering walls and carefully balanced load distribution, especially in regions exposed to strong winds. Highland conditions would have made such design considerations essential for long-term durability. You place your hand against the wall again. It is colder here than in the corridor, almost unresponsive, yet it feels steady in a way that is difficult to describe. Not comforting, but reliable. A faint draft moves through the vertical space, and you can hear it rise and fall in soft cycles. The wind outside is still present, but now it feels structured by the tower, guided into patterns rather than chaos. You notice a narrow wooden door set into the stone at waist height. It is slightly ajar, you do not remember seeing it before. You approach it slowly and pause before touching it. The wood is aged, darkened by time, and reinforced with small iron fittings that have begun to dull. Doors like this were often used in medieval towers to separate functional spaces, sometimes leading to storage areas, sometimes to service passages used by workers who moved unseen through the structure. A curious detail from regional building studies suggests that some towers incorporated secondary routes specifically designed for servants or maintenance staff, allowing movement without crossing main chambers. However, the extent to which this was standardized remains debated among researchers studying Highland architecture. You push the door gently so it opens with minimal resistance, revealing a small chamber beyond. Inside, there is no furniture, only stone walls and a faint circular shape worn into the floor, possibly from repeated placement of a heavy object over many years. The air here is still, almost untouched compared to the rest of the tower. You step inside. The silence feels denser here, as if the room has not been disturbed in a long time. Even the sound of the storm outside seems muted. You notice markings on one wall. They are not decorative in any obvious sense, just shallow grooves, possibly carved for practical reasons or as informal records. In some medieval contexts, markings like this were used for counting, tracking supplies, or simply passing time during long periods of isolation. A quieter tradition, mentioned in a few historical accounts but not universally verified, suggests that people in remote posts sometimes carved simple symbols or lines to mark days spent in isolation. Whether this was widespread or occasional remains uncertain. You let your eyes adjust further. The room feels less like a living space and more like a pause in the structure of the tower itself. After a moment, you step back out into the corridor. The transition feels immediate. as if you have moved between two different versions of silence. The storm continues outside, and the tower continues to hold it at a distance, maintaining its long negotiation with weather, time, and memory. You begin walking again, deeper into the lower levels. Each step carries a faint echo that rises and dissolves quickly, never fully leaving the stone. And somewhere above you, the higher rooms remain still, holding their empty perches and sleeping platforms, waiting through the long Highland night. You continue downward, and the tower begins to feel different in a way that is hard to define at first. It is not simply that you're going lower, it is that the air itself seems older here, heavier, as if it has been held in place longer than the air above. The spiral staircase tightens again, and each step carries a faint vibration through the stone, like the memory of countless feet before yours. The sound of the storm is now distant but not absent. It arrives in soft pulses through the structure, filtered by layers of stone and thickness. Medieval builders often relied on this kind of natural dampening, especially in remote fortifications where wind pressure could be extreme, in highland regions where storms could last for days. Architecture had to function as both shelter and buffer, absorbing forces that modern buildings would distribute differently. As you descend, you notice the walls change subtly. The stone here is rougher, less uniform, with small imperfections that suggest earlier construction phases. Many medieval towers were built in stages, sometimes over generations, with different masons leaving behind slightly different styles of cutting and fitting. That layered construction is well documented in archaeological studies of European defensive buildings, where analysis of masonry often reveals shifting techniques across centuries. You reach a broader landing, and the staircase opens into a corridor that feels more utilitarian than the spaces above. There is less decoration here, fewer carved details, and more emphasis on function. The ceiling is lower, forcing you to adjust your posture slightly as you walk forward. A mainstream historical observation about lower tower levels is that they were often used for storage or service functions, where temperature stability mattered more than comfort. Food supplies, equipment, and sometimes animals were kept in these areas because the stone maintained a relatively constant cold environment, which helped preserve goods in the absence of modern refrigeration. You pass a series of recessed niches built into the walls. Some are empty, while others contain remnants of wooden frames or iron hooks. These were likely used for hanging tools, lanterns, or storage bags. The arrangement feels methodical, suggesting repeated use rather than temporary occupation. There is also a faint smell here, almost imperceptible, but persistent. It carries traces of old smoke and damp wood, layered with something mineral and cold. It reminds you that stone structures, especially in wet climates like the Highlands, constantly absorb and release moisture over time. You pause near one niche and lean slightly closer. Inside, you notice a faint engraving, partially worn away. It is not immediately clear what it represents. It could be a simple mark of ownership or a tally line, or it might be something more symbolic. In some medieval contexts, marks like this were used by workers to record shifts or supply usage, but interpretation often depends on the broader archaeological context of the site. A quieter scholarly debate exists around whether such markings in remote towers were purely practical, or whether they sometimes carried personal or ritual meaning for those who lived in isolation. The evidence is fragmentary, and conclusions vary widely depending on region and preservation conditions. You move on. The corridor bends slightly, and ahead you see a heavier wooden door reinforced with iron bands. This door is larger and more substantial than the others you have encountered so far. It is set into an arch of stone that appears deliberately strengthened, suggesting this area required additional security or insulation. You reach out and place your hand on the wood. It is colder than expected, almost numb to touch, and the iron bands are slick with condensation. For a moment, you simply listen. The storm outside is quieter here, reduced to a low-pressure sound that seems to sit behind the stone rather than pass through it. Inside the tower, everything feels layered in this way. Sound, temperature, even time itself seem to be filtered into different densities. You push the door open. It swings inwards slowly, revealing a larger chamber beyond. This room is different again. It is wider, with a higher ceiling supported by thick stone arches. The floor is uneven but more open, and there is evidence of long-term use that feels less domestic and more operational. You notice shallow grooves in the floor where heavy objects may have been dragged repeatedly over time. In medieval fortified towers, lower chambers like this were often used for storage of supplies, equipment, or sometimes as holding areas during travel or hunting expeditions. Falconry households in particular required careful management of feed, leather gear, and transport crates for birds, all of which needed secure and cool environments. You step inside fully. The air here is colder than the corridor, but also more stable. It does not shift as much. It feels held in place. Along one wall, you notice wooden supports fixed into the stone. They are more robust than the perches above, thicker and more utilitarian. These may have been used for larger equipment or transport cages. Falconry records from the medieval period describe elaborate systems for moving birds between estates, sometimes involving covered perches and specialized carriers to protect them during long journeys. A curious detail from historical accounts suggests that some noble households treated falcons almost as diplomatic gifts, exchanging them between regions as symbols of alliance or favour, while not universally practiced. Such exchanges are documented in court records across parts of Europe. You walk slowly across the chamber. Your footsteps echo differently here, less sharp and more absorbed. Up. As if the room is intentionally softening sound, the stone seems denser, more compacted. There is a faint pool of light in one corner, where a narrow opening allows snow-filtered light to enter. It falls in a thin column, illuminating drifting particles in the air that move slowly like suspended dust or ash. The effect is almost still. Despite the storm outside, you approach the light. As you stand within it, the cold becomes more noticeable again, not because it is stronger, but because it is more direct. The light carries no warmth, only clarity. You notice a carved symbol on the floor near the edge of the illuminated space. It is simple, possibly functional, but worn enough that its original meaning is uncertain. Marks like this appear in several medieval structures and are often interpreted as identifiers, directional guides, or even construction markers left by masons. Some interpretive traditions suggest that repeated symbols in towers like this could also have held protective significance, though this remains speculative and not widely accepted in formal architectural studies. You move away from the light and toward the centre of the chamber. There is a sense here of containment, as if the tower is compressing its own internal space into something more controlled. It is not oppressive exactly, but it is deliberate. A faint sound rises from somewhere deeper within the structure. It could be wind passing through narrow channels, or it could be the movement of settling stone. In older narratives from Highland regions, such ambiguous sounds were sometimes described as the tower speaking. Though this is clearly metaphorical language rather than literal belief, you stop and listen for a moment longer than necessary. The sound does not repeat in a predictable way. You continue walking. The chamber gradually narrows again toward another passage, suggesting that the structure is guiding you deeper rather than outward. The architecture feels intentional in this way, as if each space is a controlled transition between states of exposure and enclosure. You realize that you have now reached one of the lowest accessible parts of the tower. The air is still, almost completely insulated from the storm above, yet you remain aware of it, like a distant presence pressing against the outer skin of the structure. You take one last look around the chamber. Stone, light, shadow, and silence all layered together. And then you move forward again, deeper into the tower's remaining quiet. You move deeper into the lowest accessible level of the tower, and the structure begins to feel less like a building and more like something that has grown into the hillside over time. The corridor narrows until it becomes just wide enough for your shoulders, and every step forward feels like it is being measured by the stone itself. The air is still, but not empty. It carries a faint pressure, as if the tower is holding its breath around you. The storm above is no longer visible or directly audible. Instead, it arrives in fragments, a distant pulse of wind, a subtle vibration through the wall, a shifting hush that rises and falls without warning. Medieval towers in exposed regions often produce these kinds of effects because of how air moves through narrow vertical structures. Openings designed for light or defense could become channels for wind, turning external weather into interior sound. You stop near a thin vertical slit in the wall. It is narrow, almost aggressive in its simplicity, just a cut through stone, angled slightly outward. When you lean closer, you feel a faint rush of air against your cheek, cold and unpredictable. The wind does not enter steadily. It arrives in irregular bursts, as if it is searching for a way in rather than simply passing through. In medieval architecture, these openings were primarily designed as arrow slits, allowing defenders to observe or attack while remaining protected. That detail is widely documented across fortified structures from the Norman period onward, especially in Britain and parts of mainland Europe. What is less often considered is how these slits also shaped sound in unintended ways, turning wind into something that could resemble voices or whispers depending on conditions. You tilt your head slightly, listening. The sound that comes through is not consistent. At one moment it is a low hiss, and in the next it becomes something that almost resembles syllables. Though your mind quickly corrects itself, stone corridors like this often amplify selective frequencies of wind, especially when air is forced through tight angles. The result is a shifting acoustic illusion that can feel strangely intentional. You continue along the corridor, and the slits appear at regular intervals now. Each one offers a slightly different relationship with the storm outside. Some produce sharp, cutting notes of wind. Others create softer tones that seem almost like distant breath. Together they form a pattern that is not musical, but not entirely random either. A mainstream historical fact about such design features is that medieval builders often prioritized defensive visibility over comfort. Light, airflow, and line of sight were essential considerations, and insulation against sound was rarely a priority. Buildings were meant to function as working structures rather than quiet spaces, especially in border regions where vigilance mattered more than tranquility. You place your hand against one of the slits, careful not to touch the exposed opening itself. The stone around it is colder than the surrounding wall, as if the wind has permanently marked it. As you stand there, the sound shifts again. For a moment, it becomes fuller, almost layered, like multiple streams of air converging at once. Your mind instinctively tries to interpret it. That tendency is deeply human. In environments where information is limited, perception often fills gaps with familiar patterns, including language. A curious detail from medieval folklore suggests that wind passing through stone structures was sometimes thought to carry messages from distant places or even from the past. In some Highland traditions, people believed that certain buildings could speak during storms, not literally, but as a way of describing how sound transformed within enclosed stone spaces. These interpretations were not uniform, but they appear repeatedly in oral histories and regional storytelling. You move your hand away from the slit and continue forward. The corridor bends slightly, and the wind patterns change with it. Now the sound feels like it is circling you rather than passing through you. It rises along the walls, then drops unexpectedly, then returns in a different tone. It creates an impression of movement that does not match your physical position. There is an ongoing discussion among researchers studying architectural acoustics about how early builders unintentionally created spaces that amplify natural sound distortions. Some suggest that these effects may have influenced the emotional atmosphere of such buildings, especially during storms. Others argue that medieval occupants would have simply adapted to these sounds as background conditions of daily life, without attributing deeper meaning to them. You pause again, listening more carefully. The wind now feels almost rhythmic, not steady enough to be a pattern, but not chaotic either. It has intervals that your mind begins to anticipate, even though you cannot predict them precisely. That anticipation creates a subtle tension, like waiting for a word that never fully arrives. You step into a slightly wider section of the corridor. Here, the ceiling lowers unexpectedly, forcing you to tilt your head. The stonework is rougher in this area, less refined, suggesting either an earlier phase of construction or a purely functional addition. Many medieval towers evolved in this way, with structural changes layered over time as needs shifted between defense, habitation, and storage. You notice another slit ahead, but this one is partially blocked by accumulated snow pressed against the exterior opening. Only a faint glow filters through it, diffused and unstable. When you approach it, the wind behaves differently again. It is softer here, almost hesitant. Instead of sharp intrusion, it arrives as a slow fall that seems to linger before fading. The contrast between different openings within the same structure creates a layered acoustic environment that feels almost intentional, even if it was never designed to be experienced in this way. You find yourself wondering how people once slept or worked in conditions like this. The constant variation in sound would have been unavoidable. Every shift in weather would have changed the interior atmosphere in subtle ways. A scholarly interpretation sometimes proposed in studies of isolated medieval architecture is that inhabitants may have developed heightened sensitivity to environmental cues, using sound changes as indicators of weather shifts, time, or even safety conditions. While this remains interpretive rather than definitive, it aligns with known adaptive behaviors in pre-modern societies. You continue deeper into the corridor. The wind begins to thin out slightly, but its presence becomes more concentrated. Instead of multiple overlapping sounds, you now hear isolated bursts that feel more distinct. Each one seems to come from a specific slit, as if the tower is dividing the storm into individual pieces for you to experience one at a time. You stop at another opening. This one is different. The slit is wider, and the wind entering through it is stronger. It presses against your face with a suddenness that feels almost physical, like a brief push. For a moment, the sound becomes overwhelming, filling the narrow corridor with a dense rush that drowns out everything else. Then it fades just as quickly. In that occasions after the surge, you become aware of something subtle in the structure, a faint resonance, like the stone itself is slowly settling back into equilibrium. Buildings of this age often respond continuously to temperature and pressure changes, expanding and contracting in ways that are imperceptible individually but noticeable in aggregate over time. You move away from the slit and continue forward. The corridor now begins to slope upward slightly. Though only gently, it is not a clear ascent, more a gradual shift in elevation that changes how sound travels. The wind becomes less direct here, more diffused again, as if the tower is transitioning you back toward its central core. You realize that you are no longer simply moving through space, you're moving through layers of sound, temperature, and memory that overlap in unpredictable ways. The stone ahead darkens slightly, suggesting another chamber or junction is approaching. The air feels steadier now, less fragmented, and somewhere above, the storm continues to press against the tower, reshaping itself endlessly against the walls that refuse to yield. You take another slow step forward, and the wind follows. but more gently this time, as if it's beginning to quiet itself around you. You continue along the gently rising corridor, and the change in elevation is so subtle that you almost doubt it at first. The tower does not announce its structure in obvious ways. Instead, it reveals itself through small shifts in pressure, sound, and the way your footsteps begin to echo slightly differently against the stone. The air here feels less compressed than the lowest levels, but still deeply insulated from the storm outside. It is as if the building has multiple internal climates stacked on top of one another, each one shaped by a height, thickness of wall, and proximity to the wind-exposed exterior. As you move forward, the corridor widens just enough for you to turn your shoulders without brushing the walls. The stone surface is smoother here in places, suggesting repeated contact over time, not polished in any deliberate sense, but softened by centuries of touch, cloth, and movement. You notice another slit window ahead. This one is taller than the earlier openings, and the snow outside clings to its edges in uneven patterns. When you approach it, you see the Highlands again, though only in fragments. The world beyond is still reduced to shifting layers of white and grey, but there is a faint sense of depth returning, as if distance is reasserting itself, presses through the opening in irregular pulses. It does not behave like a straight force. It curls slightly as it enters, then disperses along the corridor ceiling. This kind of airflow is common in narrow medieval structures where openings are positioned at different heights and angles, creating complex interior wind patterns that were never fully controlled, only endured. You pause beside the slit and listen. The sound is not uniform. At moments it feels almost like a drawn-out breath. Then it breaks into softer fragments that scatter along the walls. Your mind naturally tries to organize it, to assign meaning or structure, but it never fully settles into anything predictable. In historical accounts of remote stone towers, there are occasional references to how wind behaved strangely inside buildings during severe weather, sometimes described in terms that suggested presence or intention. Modern architectural studies explain these effects through turbulence and resonance, especially when airflow is forced through uneven stone channels. Still, the subjective experience of such sound often shaped how inhabitants emotionally interpreted storms. You step away from the opening, the corridor continues forward, and the stone here shows faint variations in colour. Some sections are darker, almost soot-stained, while others are lighter, as if they were replaced or repaired at different points in time. Medieval construction rarely happened in a single uninterrupted phase. Instead, towers were often modified as needs changed, whether due to damage, expansion, or shifting ownership. You run your fingers lightly along the wall without pressing too hard. The texture changes slightly under your touch. Some parts feel grainy and rough, while others are more compact, almost dense. These differences suggest repairs made at different times using slightly different materials or techniques, something commonly observed in long-lived stone structures across Europe. Ahead, the corridor opens into a small junction. From here, you can see two possible directions. One continues forward along a narrow passage, while the other curves slightly upward again, toward what feels like a more central part of the tower. The space between them is marked by a thick supporting arch that bears visible weight from above. You stop beneath the arch. There is a faint draft here that circulates in slow, almost circular movement. It is not strong enough to push you, but noticeable enough that you can feel it shifting against your clothing in waves. The tower seems to breathe in this space, not in any living sense, but through the continuous movement of air pressure balancing across different internal levels. You choose the upward path. As you move, the corridor becomes slightly brighter, not from direct light, but from a diffusion of brightness filtering through multiple openings above. The snow outside reflects what little daylight exists, scattering it through the stone in pale, diluted tones at one point. You notice a shallow recess carved into the wall. Inside it are faint traces of metal fittings, possibly once used to secure a lantern or hanging object. In medieval towers, lighting systems were carefully managed, especially in multi-level structures where fire safety and visibility had to be balanced. Lanterns were often moved between fixed points rather than left burning continuously in one location. You linger for a moment near the recess. It feels like a place where something important once regularly returned, though there is no clear indication of what that might have been. A small detail from archaeological studies of similar Highland structures suggests that lighting points were sometimes reused across generations, with new fittings added over older ones rather than replacing them entirely. This layering of practical modifications often creates the kind of visual complexity you are now seeing in the stone. You continue forward. The corridor begins to curve more noticeably, and the sound of wind shifts again. It becomes less fragmented here, more continuous, as if multiple airflow paths are merging into a single channel. The sensation is not louder, but more unified. You realise that you are approaching a more central vertical section of the tower. The architecture subtly confirms this. The walls are thicker, the stone more uniform, and the spacing of openings more deliberate. Everything feels structurally reinforced, as if this part of the tower was designed to carry more weight and withstand greater pressure from above. You reach another small opening in the wall. Through it, the storm appears slightly less chaotic than before. The snow still moves in dense sheets, but there are brief moments where the landscape beyond becomes momentarily clearer, revealing faint contours of hills beneath the white cover. It disappears again almost immediately. You notice how your perception adjusts quickly to these brief changes. The brain tries to build a continuous image from fragmented visual input, even when the environment does not allow it. You step away and continue. The corridor now feels more enclosed again, though not in a restrictive way. It is more like moving through the structural spine of the tower, where everything above and below is held in balance. A soft sound emerges ahead. It is subtle, almost indistinguishable from wind, but slightly different in tone. You pause, listening carefully. It does not repeat in a predictable rhythm, but it persists just enough to remain noticeable. In older oral accounts from Highland regions, there are references to buildings that answered storms through internal sound shifts, though these descriptions are clearly metaphorical or symbolic rather than literal. Modern interpretations tend to link these experiences to acoustics and airflow interacting within enclosed stone environments. You continue toward the sound. The corridor narrows slightly again before opening into a more vertical space. Looking up, you can see faint layers of the tower rising above you, the structure becoming less horizontal and more column-like here. Light filters down in thin strands, broken by internal beams and stone supports. You stop beneath this vertical section. The wind feels more organized now, moving in steady upward currents rather than irregular bursts. It is as if the tower is channeling external force into a controlled internal movement. You stand still for a moment longer than necessary. The sound, the light, and the structural converge into a single layered experience that feels both distant and immediate at the same time. Then you take another step forward, deeper into the tower's rising core. You step into the vertical section of the tower, and the sense of direction shifts immediately. It is no longer just a corridor or a passage. It feels like you have entered the central spine of the structure, where everything above and below is quietly held in alignment. The air rises here in slow, steady currents, as if the tower is exhaling through its own height. Stone surrounds you on all sides, but it does not feel identical. Some sections are smooth and tight, fitted with careful precision, while others show slight irregularities that hint at different phases of construction. Medieval builders rarely worked with a single uninterrupted plan in remote locations like this. Instead, structures evolved gradually, often shaped by available resources, weather conditions, and shifting needs over decades or even centuries. You move forward slowly, and the sound of the storm becomes faint again, reduced to a distant pressure rather than a direct presence. In these central sections of tall stone buildings, wind often loses its chaotic character and becomes more directional, guided by vertical shafts and internal voids. A narrow slit above you lets in a faint column of light. It is thin and unstable, filtered through snow and cloud layers outside. The light does not illuminate the space evenly. Instead, it creates a soft gradient that fades almost immediately into shadow, making the stone appear to breathe in and out as you move. You pause beneath it. There is something about this section of the tower that feels different from the lower levels. Not warmer, but more structured, as if the building is less about shelter here and more about control of movement, both human and environmental. In medieval architecture, central vertical spaces like this often served multiple purposes. They could function as ventilation channels, structural reinforcement cores, or simply transitional zones between floors. The exact usage often varied by region and period, and surviving records do not always provide clear answers. You take another step. The floor beneath you changes subtly in texture. It is more worn in a narrow line down the centre, suggesting repeated passage along a consistent route. This kind of wear pattern is frequently observed in archaeological studies of long-used stone structures, where human movement gradually shapes even the hardest materials. You notice a faint recess in the wall. Inside it, there is a shallow basin carved into stone. It is empty now, but its shape suggests it once held something small or functional. In medieval towers, such basins were sometimes used for water collection, oil storage, or ritual washing, depending on local practice and period. Interpretation often depends on context, and in many cases the original purpose remains uncertain. You lean slightly closer, observing the worn edges. The stone around it is smoother than the surrounding wall, indicating repeated contact over time. Whatever it once held must have been used frequently enough to leave a lasting mark. You continue upward. The staircase returns, but this one is different from the earlier spiral. It is wider and less enclosed, built into the central shaft rather than hugging the outer wall. Each step is slightly uneven, and you find yourself adjusting your pace carefully to match its rhythm. As you climb, the wind becomes more present again, but not in a disruptive way. It moves through the tower in layered currents, rising from below and slipping past you as it continues upward. The sensation is less like being surrounded by weather, and more like being inside a system that is processing it. In medieval fortified towers, this kind of airflow was often unavoidable. Builders prioritized structural strength and defensibility over airtight insulation, meaning internal air movement was an inherent feature of tall stone buildings, especially those exposed to strong regional winds like those in the Highlands. You reach a small landing halfway up the shaft. Here, the architecture opens slightly into a circular space where several narrow passages intersect. The ceiling above is higher, and you can see faint beams of light filtering through gaps in the upper structure. You pause in the centre. The wind behaves differently here again. It does not move in a single direction. Instead, it circulates gently around the space, creating a slow rotational motion that you can feel against your clothing. It is subtle, but noticeable enough that your sense of balance adjusts slightly. You glance toward one of the passages. It is darker than the others, leading into what appears to be another interior level. The stone around its entrance is more worn, suggesting frequent use compared to the other routes in many medieval towers. Such branching points allowed movement between functional zones, separating living quarters, storage areas, and access paths. You choose the darker passage. As you enter, the sound of the storm fades further, replaced by a quieter internal rhythm. The walls here are closer together again, and the air feels more still. There is a faint scent of old stone and cold mineral moisture that becomes more noticeable as external noise decreases. You notice small markings on the wall. They are not decorative, just faint grooves, possibly made by tools or repeated contact over time, in some historical interpretations of similar structures. Such marks are thought to be incidental rather than intentional, formed through decades of use rather than deliberate inscription. Others suggest they may have been practical indicators used by workers or residents to track movement or tasks. The truth is often difficult to determine in such environments, where time has erased most clear context. You continue forward, the passage begins to slope upward again, and the stone becomes more uniform. This suggests a more deliberately constructed section of the tower, possibly part of a later phase of building or reinforcement. Medieval towers often show this kind of internal inconsistency, where older foundations are gradually integrated into newer structural plans. You feel the air change slightly as you climb. It becomes thinner in sensation, not in oxygen, but in density of sound and pressure. The silence here is more complete, interrupted only by faint internal echoes of your movement. You reach another small opening. Through it, you see only a fragment of the outside world. Snow continues to fall heavily, but there is a brief moment where the horizon becomes visible. A soft layering of distant terrain hidden beneath white cover. It disappears again, almost instantly. You linger for a moment longer than necessary. The contrast between inside and outside feels sharper here than in previous levels. The tower no longer feels like a shelter from the storm. It feels like a separate system entirely, operating in parallel with it. You move on. The passage widens again into a narrow chamber with a higher ceiling. The stone here is smoother, and the arrangement of the space suggests intentional design rather than gradual adaptation. It may have served as a transitional hub between levels or a place where movement was controlled and organized. You notice a faint ledge carved into the wall. It runs along a portion of the chamber at chest height. It could have supported objects, tools, or even lighting fixtures in medieval architecture. Such ledges were often multifunctional, adapted to local needs rather than assigned a single purpose. You trace the air just above it without touching. The surface below feels stable, grounded, almost reassuring in its simplicity. A subtle sound returns, carried through the stone from somewhere above. It is not distinct, but it suggests movement or shifting pressure in the upper structure. Buildings of this scale often produce continuous micro-sounds due to thermal changes, wind load, and structural settling. You stop and listen. The sound does not resolve into anything recognizable. After a moment, you continue forward. The chamber leads into another upward transition, and the tower feels like it is drawing you gradually toward its highest internal regions again. Each step carries you slightly closer to the place where stone meets storm most directly, and the silence behind you begins to feel deeper with every movement upward. You continue upward, and the tower begins to feel less like a series of rooms, and more like a single continuous ascent through compressed history. The stone narrows around you again, drawing your attention inward with every step. It is not claustrophobic, exactly, but it is focused, as if the structure itself is guiding your movement along a path it has already decided. The air changes subtly as you climb, becomes lighter in near pressure, though not warmer. Instead, it carries a faint dryness that contrasts with the damp cold of the lower levels, in tall medieval stone structures. This kind of variation was common because heat from occasional fires, combined with external wind pressure, created layered internal climates that shifted with height and exposure. You pause briefly on a step and place your hand against the wall. The stone here feels slightly different, less coarse, more uniform, as if it was shaped with greater care or built during a later phase of construction. Many Highland towers show this kind of layered masonry, where initial defensive cores were expanded or reinforced over time as wealth. Need or strategic importance changed. Ahead, the staircase opens into a narrow vertical shaft where light filters down in broken strands. The light is not strong, but it is persistent, fractured by unseen beams above. It gives the impression of depth extending far beyond what you can currently see. You climb into it. The sound of your footsteps becomes more pronounced here. Each step echoes upward and downward simultaneously, creating a strange sense that the tower is responding in both directions at once. The acoustics of vertical stone shafts often produce this effect, where sound reflects repeatedly between surfaces before dispersing into silence. As you ascend, you notice small recesses in the wall. They are shallow, evenly spaced, and partially worn. Their purpose is not immediately obvious. In some medieval structures, such recesses were used to hold temporary supports during construction or repair, while in others they served as anchor points for wooden scaffolding or ladders that have long since been removed. You continue upward. The wind becomes more noticeable again, though it does not enter directly. Instead, it moves through the tower in layered streams, rising from lower openings and slipping past upper gaps. It creates a sense of vertical circulation, as if the storm outside is being slowly reorganized by the structure itself. A faint sound emerges above you. It is not distinct enough to identify, but it carries a quality that makes you slow your pace in. It could be air moving through narrow architectural channels, or it could be the interaction of wind with uneven stone openings. In older descriptions of Highland towers, such sounds were sometimes interpreted emotionally by occupants. Though modern understanding attributes them to complex airflow patterns, you reach another landing. This one is smaller and more enclosed than the previous junctions. The ceiling is lower, and the space feels intentionally compressed, as if designed for transition rather than occupation. There is a narrow opening on one side that allows a brief glimpse of the outside world. You approach it. Through the slit, the Highlands appear again, but now they are more distant in a vertical sense. You are high enough that the landscape feels flattened, reduced to soft contours beneath heavy snowfall. The storm continues to obscure detail, but there is a faint suggestion of movement far beyond the tower. You linger for a moment. The wind presses through the opening in a steady but restrained flow. It is less chaotic here, more organized by heightened structure. In medieval architecture, upper levels of towers often experience stronger but more consistent wind patterns due to reduced ground interference, which shaped how these spaces were used. You step back from the opening. The landing leads into another staircase, narrower than before. This one feels more deliberate, almost ceremonial in its precision. The steps are evenly spaced, and the walls are smoother, suggesting a more refined phase of construction. You begin to climb again. With each slip, the sound of the storm becomes less like weather and more like background presence. It is still there, but it no longer dominates your attention. Instead, the internal rhythm of the tower takes over. Stone, air, movement, and silence all layered together. A small detail catches your attention. On one of the steps, there is a faint indentation. It is shallow but clearly repeated, as if something heavy or frequently used rested there over time. In medieval structures, such wear patterns often reveal long-term usage behaviours that are not recorded in written documents. Archaeologists sometimes use these subtle physical traces to infer movement routes or activity zones within buildings. You continue upward. The staircase begins to curve slightly inward toward a tighter vertical core. The stone here is more consistent, with fewer visible repairs or variations. It feels like a central structural spine, built for endurance rather than adaptation. You notice another opening above. This one is brighter. The light filtering through is stronger and more diffuse, suggesting proximity to the upper levels of the tower where exposure to the sky is less obstructed. The brightness is not direct sunlight, but a pale, scattered illumination shaped by cloud and snow reflection. You climb toward it. As you approach, the wind becomes more active again. It does not enter forcefully, but it interacts with the opening in complex patterns, creating soft fluctuations in pressure that you can feel across your face and hands. You step into a small chamber just below the uppermost section. This space is different in atmosphere. It feels less enclosed, more open to external conditions. The ceiling is higher, and there are multiple narrow slits arranged around the perimeter, allowing light and air to enter from different angles. You stand still for a moment. The sound here is layered. Wind moving through multiple openings creates a shifting acoustic feel that changes depending on where you stand. It is not consistent, but it is not random either. It responds to position, height, and angle in subtle ways. In some historical interpretations of medieval towers, upper chambers like this were used for observation or signalling, though evidence varies depending on site and region. Some were purely functional lookout spaces, while others may have served symbolic or administrative roles connected to land oversight. You walk slowly across the chamber. The floor is slightly cooler here, as if the stone is closer to external temperature fluctuations. You notice faint structural beams overhead, darkened by age and exposure. These supports carry the weight of the uppermost tower sections, distributing pressure downward through the core. You look upward. The final section of the tower rises above you, narrowing toward what might be the roof or an observation platform. Light filters down from that highest point in shifting patterns, broken by structural elements you cannot fully see from below. You remain still for a moment longer. The storm is closest here in feeling, even though it is not directly visible. It surrounds the upper structure like a moving boundary, pressing against the tower's highest edges. Then you begin to move again toward the final ascent. Each step feels lighter, but more exposed, and the tower continues to guide you upward, toward its highest point where stone meets sky. You begin the final ascent toward the uppermost part of the tower, and the atmosphere changes again in a way that is almost imperceptible at first. The air feels thinner in presence, not in breathability, but in weight. It is as if the structure is shedding layers of enclosure with every step upward, allowing more of the outside world to press in through invisible seams. The staircase narrows once more, guiding you into a tighter spiral that wraps around the central core. Each step is slightly more exposed to faint drafts that slip through unseen gaps in the stonework. These currents are not strong, but they are constant enough to remind you that you are approaching the tower's upper boundary with the sky. Stone here is different again. It carries a more uniform texture, with fewer irregularities. That consistency suggests a later phase of construction or reinforcement, possibly added after the original core was already established. Many medieval towers evolved in this layered way, with upper sections refined or rebuilt to improve stability against wind stress and weather exposure. You pause briefly and place your hand against the wall. It feels colder than the lower levels, but also more responsive in a subtle sense, as if it is more directly in contact with the external environment. In tall stone structures, temperature shifts become more pronounced with height, especially in exposed regions where wind and precipitation can vary rapidly. The sound of the storm grows slightly stronger again as you climb, not because it has intensified, but because you are closer to where it interacts most directly with the tower. The upper sections act like a listening surface for the weather, translating wind into subtle internal movement. You reach a small landing. This space is narrower than those below, but brighter. Light filters in from multiple directions, broken into soft fragments by stone edges and structural beams. The brightness is not steady. It shifts with the movement of clouds and snowfall outside, creating a gentle flicker across the interior surfaces. You notice a series of narrow openings arranged along the outer wall. These slits are higher and more angular than the ones below, designed to provide both light and ventilation while maintaining structural integrity. In medieval architecture, upper-level openings often had to balance exposure with stability, especially in regions where storms could exert significant lateral pressure on tall structures. You approach one of the openings. The view outside is more expansive now. The Highlands stretch out in muted layers of white and grey, with no clear horizon line. Snow continues to fall steadily, but the sense of scale is different from what you experienced at lower levels. From here, the landscape feels both closer and more distant at the same time. Wind moves through the opening in steady pulses. It is less chaotic than before, more structured by altitude and pressure. The sound it produces is softer, almost like a continuous exhale from the surrounding environment. In some architectural studies of elevated stone structures, this kind of airflow is noted as a natural consequence of vertical wind channels interacting with narrow apertures. You step away from the opening and continue along the landing. There is a faint curvature to the path, guiding you toward a final internal ascent. The stone here is smooth in places, worn by centuries of movement, though the pattern of wear is lighter than in lower sections, suggesting less frequent use or more specialized access. You begin climbing again. The staircase now feels closer to the surface of the tower. Each step brings you nearer to direct exposure, and you can sense the outside world more clearly through subtle variations in temperature and sound. The storm is no longer something separate. It is now layered directly against the structure around you. A faint vibration passes through the stone. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it travels through the wall and into your hand as you steady yourself. Tall stone towers often respond continuously to wind load, especially at upper levels where pressure differences are most pronounced. These micro movements are not visible, but they are constantly present. You reach another narrow passage. This one is shorter, leading quickly into a small enclosed chamber just beneath the top of the tower. The ceiling is lower than expected, but there is a sense of openness created by multiple light sources filtering in from above and around the edges. You step inside, the sound changes immediately. It becomes more layered here, with wind entering from multiple angles and interacting with the interior space in complex ways. Instead of a single dominant direction, the airflow divides and recombines, creating shifting acoustic patterns that change as you move. You stand still for a moment. The chamber feels like a transition point between interior protection and full external exposure. It is not yet the top, but it is no longer fully enclosed either. You notice faint structural beams overhead. They are darkened with age, and their placement suggests reinforcement for the uppermost platform. In medieval towers, roof structures were often rebuilt or repaired multiple times due to constant exposure to weather. That layering of maintenance creates complex architectural histories that are still visible in surviving stonework today. You move slowly toward the center of the chamber. The floor here is slightly uneven, shaped by long-term settling of the structure. It is not unstable, but it carries a sense of quiet movement, as if the tower is constantly adjusting itself in response to external forces. A narrow opening leads upward from here. It is partially visible through shifting light, and it suggests the final exit, the top level. The wind is stronger here, but still controlled by the structure, entering in measured bursts rather than continuous force. You pause before continuing. The sound of the storm is closest now, not overwhelming, but fully present. It presses against the upper walls in a way that feels direct, as if the tower is holding a conversation with the weather. In some regional accounts of Highland architecture, upper tower levels were sometimes described as spaces where the boundary between structure and environment felt thinnest. These descriptions are not technical, but they reflect a consistent experiential theme found in historical narratives of exposed stone buildings. You begin the final ascent. The steps are tighter now, and each one brings you closer to open air. Light becomes brighter, not harsh, but diffuse and shifting. Snowlight reflects through the upper structure in soft gradients that move with the wind. You climb steadily. The last few steps feel different. Not more difficult, but more immediate. You're no longer deep within the tower, you're almost at its surface. The sound of the storm is now all around you, no longer filtered by multiple layers of stone. And just ahead, the final threshold begins to form in the light. You reach the final threshold, and for a moment you do not move. The staircase ends in a tight curve of stone that seems to hesitate before opening upward, as if even the architecture is aware of what lies beyond it. The air here is the most active you have felt so far. It does not simply move through the tower anymore. It presses against it from all directions at once. Each breath you take feels slightly sharper, shaped by cold that is no longer filtered or softened by deeper walls. The upper structure of the tower is thin in comparison to what you have passed through below, and that thinness changes everything. Sound, temperature, and even the sensation of space become less contained. You step upward. The final few steps are narrow and worn in a way that suggests constant exposure rather than constant use. Stone at this level carries a different kind of history. It is not shaped by daily movement alone, but also by weather, wind pressure, and the slow erosion of seasons. As you climb, the light grows brighter, though it is not sunlight in any direct sense. It is a diffuse glow created by snow clouds reflecting and scattering what little daylight exists above the Highlands. The result is a soft brightness that feels suspended rather than directional. You reach the final opening. For a moment, you remain just below it, listening. The wind is no longer fragmented, it is unified here, moving as a single continuous presence around the top of the tower. It does not enter the structure randomly, it flows across it, over it, and through the gaps in a constant cycle that feels almost structured in its repetition. You step through, the transition is immediate. The tower opens into its highest accessible platform, and suddenly there is no more enclosure above you. The sky is not clear, but it is present in a way that feels absolute. Snow falls in steady, drifting layers that move horizontally more often than vertically, carried by strong highland winds that shape everything they touch. You are standing at the top of the medieval Falcon Tower. The stone beneath your feet is uneven and cold, and it carries the full force of exposure. Every surface here is shaped by weather rather than interior use. There are faint edges of carved stone around the perimeter, forming a low boundary that separates the platform from the drop beyond. It is not high enough to block the view, only enough to suggest intention. From this height, the Highlands are no longer a landscape in the usual sense. They are a vast, shifting field of white and muted grey, layered in soft gradients that erase depth and redefine distance. Hills appear and disappear as snow density changes, creating a rhythm of visibility that feels almost like breathing. You take a slow step forward. Wind immediately presses against you. Not violently, but persistently. It is stronger here, but also more consistent. Upper levels of tall stone structures often experience wind patterns that are smoother than those below, because there are fewer obstructions to disrupt airflow. The result is a continuous pressure that feels less chaotic and more absolute. You look around the platform. There are faint structural remnants here, low stone ridges that may have supported a former wooden framework, small anchor points embedded in the stone that suggest something once stood above or around this open area. In medieval towers, upper platforms were often modified repeatedly over time, sometimes transitioning from defensive observation points to more specialized uses such as signaling or falconry observation. You move carefully along the edge. Each step is deliberate, not because of instability, but because of exposure. The tower feels more honest here. It no longer protects you in the same way. Instead, it places you directly in the same environment it has been filtering and shaping all along. A historical note often mentioned in studies of medieval elite hunting practices is that falcons were sometimes released from elevated structures to take advantage of wind currents and open sightlines. High towers offered practical advantages for training and observation, especially in regions where terrain was uneven and weather unpredictable. You pause near the edge of the platform. The wind shifts slightly, and for a brief moment, the snowfall thins just enough to reveal distant contours of land, not fully defined shapes, but suggestions of hills beneath the white cover. Then it closes again, as if the landscape itself is being gently erased and redrawn. There is something quietly disorienting about this height. Not fear exactly, but a sense of scale that no longer behaves in familiar ways. The world below feels both distant and immediate, compressed into a soft, shifting surface that never fully resolves into detail. You notice the stone beneath your boots again. It is colder than anything below, not because it has changed temperature recently, but because it is fully aligned with the external environment. There is no insulation here, only direct contact with weather that has no barrier between itself and the structure. You crouch slightly and place your hand on the surface. The stone is wet in places where snow has begun to melt and refreeze. That cycle creates a thin, uneven texture that reflects faint light back into the overcast sky. In some surviving architectural studies of Highland towers, upper platforms like this are described as spaces of both function and symbolic presence. They were not only practical observation points, but also markers of ownership, visibility, and control over surrounding land. However, interpretations vary depending on how much evidence remains from specific sites, and many details remain uncertain due to erosion and later modifications. You stand again and look outward. The wind carries sound differently here. It does not echo. It disperses immediately, absorbed into the open space. Your hearing becomes more focused on near-field sensations. The rustle of your clothing, the soft impact of snow, the constant pressure of air movement. There is no enclosed acoustics anymore, only direct interaction with environment. You move closer to the center of the platform. Here, the stone is slightly raised, forming a subtle circular pattern. It may have been a mounting point for a structure that no longer exists. In medieval contexts, such features are sometimes associated with wooden lookout frames, flag supports, or specialized equipment used during hunting or communication. A detail occasionally noted in historical records of elite falconry households is the importance of elevation during bird training and release. While not all towers served this purpose, height provided a strategic advantage in controlling flight direction and observing return patterns. You imagine the platform in another time, not empty but active. Figures moving carefully along the edge, a falcon perched calmly, hooded, waiting, the sudden release into wind, the sharp movement upward into open sky. These images are not preserved in any single definitive record, but they appear across multiple fragmented sources in slightly different forms. The wind shifts again. Snow briefly clears in one direction, and you catch a wider view of the Highlands than before. The terrain stretches outward in layered distance, fading into atmospheric white. Then it softens again as snowfall returns. You exhale slowly. The air here is so open that even breathing feels like part of the weather system. There is no separation between body and environment in any meaningful sense at this height. Everything is exposed, everything is shared. A final thought passes through your awareness, not as narration, but as sensation, that this tower has been here long enough to experience countless storms like this, each one slightly different, each one leaving no visible trace beyond gradual change in stone. You remain standing at the edge of the platform. The storm continues around you, steady and patient, and the tower holds its position against it, unchanged in purpose, shaped entirely by what it endures. You remain at the top of the Falcon Tower, and for a while you do not move at all. The wind continues its steady passage across the platform, but your attention begins to shift away from motion and towards stillness. Up here, stillness is not silence, it is interaction. Every breath, every shift of weight, every subtle adjustment of posture becomes part of the environment itself. The storm has not changed in intensity, yet your perception of it continues to evolve from this height. The wind feels less like an external force and more like a continuous system flowing across the landscape and through the tower at the same time. The structure does not resist it so much as participate in it, shaping and being shaped in return. You step closer to the low stone edge of the platform. The surface is uneven beneath your boots, worn by exposure rather than use. Small variations in the stone suggest long-term erosion caused by wind carrying fine particles over centuries in exposed highland structures. This kind of gradual abrasion is a known effect, especially at elevated points where wind velocity is consistently higher than at ground level. You place your hand on the stone again. It is colder than before, or perhaps you're simply more aware of its temperature now. The difference between sensation and perception becomes less distinct up here. Everything feels more immediate, less filtered. A faint change in the wind draws your attention outward for a brief moment. The snowfall thins again, and the landscape beyond becomes slightly more legible, not clear but suggestive. Rolling terrain, softened ridges, and distant contours that appear and disappear with each shift of air. It feels as if the land itself is breathing under the storm. You notice something about the tower's edge. There are small irregular notches carved into the stone at intervals along the perimeter. They are not decorative in any obvious sense. Their spacing suggests functional placement, possibly for securing wooden elements or temporary fittings that no longer exist. In medieval towers, upper platforms were often modified repeatedly over time, and physical traces of those changes can remain even when the structures they supported have vanished. You move slowly along the edge. Each step is careful, not because the surface is unstable, but because exposure changes the way balance feels. The wind does not push consistently, it shifts direction in subtle variations, requiring constant micro-adjustments in stance. As you walk, you notice that the soundscape changes with position. Near one corner, the wind produces a lower tone. Near another, it becomes higher and more fragmented. These variations are caused by the way air flows around irregular stone edges, creating shifting acoustic zones in tall stone structures, especially those exposed to strong weather systems. These variations can be surprisingly distinct to anyone standing on them. You pause near one of these sound changes. It is not louder here, but more textured. The wind carries multiple layers of movement that overlap without fully merging. You listened for a moment longer than you intended, and the sensation becomes almost immersive, as if the tower is translating weather into subtle auditory patterns. You continue walking. The platform begins to curve gently, following the circular shape of the tower's top. The stone here is slightly more uniform, suggesting reinforcement or later repairs. Many medieval towers underwent maintenance cycles, particularly in exposed environments where weather damage accumulated continuously. You notice a faint depression in the stone near your path. It is shallow but clearly intentional, possibly a mounting point or a place where a wooden structure once rested. Some upper towers included viewing frames, small shelters, or even temporary platforms for observation during specific seasonal activities. Exact functions often vary between sites. Depending on local needs and historical adaptation, you stop again. The wind shifts suddenly, and for a moment it becomes stronger. Snow sweeps across the platform in a horizontal wave, briefly obscuring the landscape entirely. Then it passes, leaving the view partially restored but still unstable. You realize how quickly perception adapts here. What feels like change is often just variation within a constant system. The storm is not moving toward or away from you. It is simply present in multiple states at once, and your position determines how you experience it. You step closer to the center of the platform. There is a faint circular arrangement in the stone here, subtle but noticeable when you look for it. It may indicate a former structural anchor, or a point of repeated activity. In archaeological studies of similar towers, such central markings are sometimes interpreted as alignment points for wooden frameworks or signalling structures. You place your foot at the center briefly. The sensation is different from the edge, less exposed, more grounded. The wind still surrounds you, but it feels slightly more balanced in this position, as if the tower distributes pressure differently at its core. A memory of falconry returns to your awareness, not as a vivid scene, but as a conceptual layering. Elevated structures like this were sometimes associated with hunting practices that relied on height, visibility, and wind conditions. Birds trained in such environments would have interacted with airflow patterns in ways that human observers carefully studied and refined over generations. You look outward again. The Highlands are still mostly obscured, but there are occasional brief openings in the snowfall that reveal distant shapes. These glimpses are fleeting, never lasting long enough to form a stable image. It creates a sense of partial understanding that never fully resolves. You turn slightly, letting the wind pass across your face. It feels cleaner here, not in a sensory sense alone, but in its lack of obstruction. Nothing interrupts its movement, no walls, no corridors, no narrow slits, just direct interaction between weather and body. In some regional interpretations of Highland Tower use, upper platforms were seen not only as functional spaces, but also as points of symbolic presence within the landscape. The idea of height carried meaning beyond practicality, often associated with authority, visibility, or connection to surrounding territory. These interpretations vary widely depending on surviving evidence, which is often incomplete or fragmented. You begin walking again along the perimeter. Each step now feels more familiar. The initial intensity of exposure has settled into a steady rhythm. The wind is no longer surprising, it is simply continuous. You notice that snow accumulates unevenly along the edge of the platform. Some sections are nearly clear, while others gather thin layers that shift and slide away with each gust. This uneven distribution is typical of elevated exposed surfaces where airflow is inconsistent across microstructures in stone. You pause one final time near the edge. The landscape beyond remains in motion, but your perception of it feels slightly steadier now. Not clearer, but more integrated, as if your senses have adjusted to the tower's way of interpreting the storm. For a long moment, nothing changes. Then you step back from the edge. The platform remains unchanged. The storm continues its passage. The tower holds its position, and you stand within it, suspended between structure and sky. You step away from the edge of the Falcon Tower's upper platform, and something in the experience shifts immediately. It is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But the exposure of the open sky begins to give way again to the presence of structure. The wind is still there, still constant, but it feels less total once you're no longer standing directly at the perimeter. The stone beneath your feet guides you back toward the central part of the platform. Each step carries a quieter echo now, softened by your familiarity with the space. What felt overwhelming moments ago has begun to settle into something more comprehensible. Not because the environment has changed, but because your perception has adjusted to it. You notice how the platform is not perfectly flat. There is a slight rise toward one side, forming a gentle unevenness that suggests long-term structural settling or intentional design for water runoff. In exposed medieval towers, upper surfaces were often shaped to prevent accumulation of snow and rain, as standing moisture could lead to freeze damage in colder climates. You pause near the center again. From here, The storm feels less like a surrounding force and more like a layered atmosphere. Snow moves in shifting patterns rather than a single unified curtain. Wind crosses at different heights, creating subtle variations in pressure that pass over your body in sequences rather than constant force. You look outward. The Highlands remain partially hidden, but the intermittent gaps in snowfall are becoming slightly more frequent, not stable, but rhythmically inconsistent, like the landscape is briefly revealing itself before retreating again. These fleeting openings create a strange sense of anticipation that never fully resolves. You turn slowly, taking in the full circular edge of the platform. The perimeter is marked by low stone ridges, worn smooth in places and chipped in others. These edges are not high enough to act as full barriers, but they define the boundary clearly enough that your movement naturally orients around them. In medieval architecture, such low protective edges were often sufficient for observation spaces, especially when the primary concern was visibility rather than full containment. You notice again the faint notches along the stone. They appear at irregular intervals, some deeper than others. Their purpose is not immediately clear, but their placement suggests repeated interaction with added structures that are no longer present. In many surviving examples of Highland towers, upper platforms were modified over time with wooden frames, temporary shelters, or signalling structures that left only partial traces in the stone. You crouch slightly and examine the surface near one of these marks. The stone here is more weathered, its surface subtly roughened by the long exposure. Windborne particles have likely contributed to this erosion over centuries, slowly reshaping even the hardest materials. This kind of gradual transformation is a well-documented feature of exposed stone architecture in mountainous and coastal environments. A gust passes over the platform. It is stronger than the previous ones, and it carries a thin veil of snow that briefly reduces visibility again. The sensation is immediate but short-lived. Within moments, the view returns, though slightly altered by shifting light and cloud density. You straighten again. The wind continues to move in layered patterns, but you are beginning to recognize its rhythm. It is not random, it has cycles, variations in pressure and direction that repeat with subtle differences rather than exact duplication. You walk slowly toward the opposite side of the platform. Here, the edge feels slightly more sheltered, though only marginally. A portion of the tower structure rises higher on this side, creating a partial barrier that alters how wind flows across the surface. This variation produces noticeable differences in sound and movement, something that medieval builders would have experienced constantly without necessarily analysing it in modern scientific terms. You stop near this partial shelter. The sound here is quieter, not because the wind is absent, but because it is redirected. Instead of direct impact, it moves along the stone before dispersing upward. The result is a soft auditory field, almost like distant movement rather than immediate presence. You look down at the stone again. There are faint discolorations in the surface, subtle shifts in tone that suggest long-term exposure to moisture and temperature variation. Over time, these conditions create patterns in stone that are not intentional but are nonetheless visible markers of environmental interaction. You begin to imagine how this space would have functioned in earlier periods, not as a single fixed environment, but as a changing one. Some days calm, some days violently exposed, most somewhere in between. In medieval Highland life, adaptation to weather was not occasional but continuous. Architecture had to accommodate constant variability rather than stable conditions. You move back toward the centre of the platform. The storm briefly intensifies again, though not dramatically. Snow thickens for a few moments, reducing depth perception. Then it eases, restoring the layered view of the Highlands beyond. There is a moment where everything feels suspended. Wind, visibility, and sound align into a single continuous presence that does not feel directional. It is simply surrounding. You stand still within it. In some interpretations of medieval tower use, Elevated platforms were not only practical but also served as observational anchors for managing surrounding land, weather, and movement. However, surviving evidence is often fragmented, and the exact role of many such spaces varies significantly depending on region and construction history. You turn slightly again. The sky above is still overcast, but there are faint variations in brightness that suggest shifting cloud density. Light filters through in uneven patches, creating soft gradients across the snow-filled air. You take a few steps closer to the center marking again. The circular arrangement in the stone becomes more noticeable when viewed from this angle. It feels intentional, though its exact purpose remains uncertain. It may have been structural, symbolic, or simply functional in ways that are no longer fully understood. You place your hand near it. The stone is colder here, or perhaps more exposed to direct wind. The difference is subtle but noticeable. A thought passes through your awareness, not as narration, but as impression, that this place has been shaped more by what passes through it than by what remains within it. The wind continues. The tower remains still, and you stand at the meeting point of both. Then, slowly, you begin to move again toward the interior opening that leads downward. You turn away from the open sky and begin to descend from the upper platform, and the change feels immediate, almost like stepping out of one version of the world into another. The wind does not vanish, but it loses its total dominance. Instead of surrounding you completely, it begins to behave like something that must pass through narrower spaces again, filtered by stone and structure. The entrance back into the tower feels smaller than you remember, even though you only just left it. The opening is framed by cold stone edges that hold traces of frost where snow has drifted in and settled before melting slightly and refreezing. As you step inside, the temperature shifts in a way that is not dramatic but unmistakable. It is not warmth that returns, but enclosure. But you begin down the first steps. The staircase feels different on the way down. Ascending had a sense of gradual exposure, a slow opening toward the sky. Descending reverses that sensation, drawing you back into layered protection. Each step feels like re-entering a deeper version of the tower, as if you're moving backward through its accumulated memory. Sound changes quickly here. The wind becomes fragmented again, breaking into smaller pieces as it interacts with internal walls and narrow passages. In tall medieval stone structures, this kind of acoustic transformation is common because airflow behaves differently once it is forced into constrained vertical channels. What felt unified outside now becomes segmented and layered again. You reach a small landing. The stone here is darker than the upper platform, likely due to long-term moisture retention and reduced exposure to direct wind. You notice faint irregular patterns along the wall, subtle variations in tone that suggest repeated contact or weathering over centuries. You pause briefly. The silence is not complete, but it is more structured now. Instead of a continuous force, the storm outside is reduced to intermittent pressure that filters through the tower in pulses. Each pulse arrives slightly differently depending on angle and height. You continue downward. As you move, the staircase widens slightly, returning to the familiar spiral that wraps around the central core. The geometry feels more stable again, less exposed to shifting external conditions. Stone once again surrounds you on all sides with consistency. A faint memory of the upper platform lingers, not as a visual image, but as a sensation of openness. The contrast between that exposure and this enclosure is sharp enough to remain present even as you descend further. You notice small recesses in the wall again. These are similar to those seen earlier in the ascent. Shallow and worn, possibly used for temporary supports or fixtures in medieval construction. Such features often accumulated over time as buildings were modified, repaired, or adapted to changing needs. Their exact purpose is often difficult to determine without broader contextual evidence. You run your hand lightly along the stone. It feels more textured here, less uniform than the upper levels. That variation suggests earlier construction phases, or areas that were less frequently renovated. You continue downward. The sound of your movement becomes softer again, absorbed more quickly by the surrounding structure. Each step produces a muted echo that dissipates almost immediately into the stone as you descend. The air grows slightly heavier, not in a physical sense, but in density of sensation. Lower levels often retain more moisture and carry more residual scent from past use, especially in structures that have endured long periods of storm exposure. You can faintly detect that mixture again. Stone, dampness, and old smoke embedded deep into the walls. You reach another corridor. This one feels more familiar, as it connects back to the internal vertical spine of the tower. The architecture here is more consistent, with evenly spaced stonework and carefully shaped passage points. You slow your pace. A subtle sound emerges again from above. It is not the wind itself, but the way it moves through the upper openings and filters downward in altered form. It arrives as a softened echo, less direct than before. In some interpretations of medieval tower acoustics, these shifting sound layers were simply accepted as environmental background. In other readings of historical accounts, occupants occasionally described the sensation of the building responding to storms, though this is understood today as metaphorical language shaped by lived experience rather than literal belief. You reach a junction where the corridor branches slightly. One path leads back toward the central chamber levels, while another continues down toward the storage areas you passed earlier. The decision is not urgent, but the architecture subtly encourages continuation downward. You choose the lower path. The passage narrows again, and the light becomes dimmer. Illumination now comes mostly from indirect reflection filtering through higher openings, creating a faint ambient glow rather than direct visibility. You notice another carved recess in the wall. Inside it, there are faint remnants of iron fittings, possibly used for hanging tools or securing equipment. In medieval fortified structures, especially those associated with hunting estates, such fittings were often distributed throughout lower levels for practical access to stored goods. You pass it slowly. The floor beneath you shows faint wear patterns, subtle grooves that suggest repeated movement along a consistent route. These patterns accumulate over long periods and often provide insight into how people navigated interior spaces without formal documentation. You continue downward. The air becomes noticeably more still again, as if the tower is settling into deeper insulation. The storm outside is now barely audible, reduced to a distant presence that feels more like memory than immediate force. You reach a broader landing. This one is more enclosed, with thicker stone walls and fewer openings. It feels like a transitional space between upper activity areas and lower storage or service levels. You pause here. The silence is heavier, but not oppressive. It feels more complete, less interrupted by external variation. The tower is now fully reasserting its internal separation from the storm. You notice a faint marking on the wall. It is shallow and irregular, possibly carved long ago in many medieval structures. Such markings are difficult to interpret with certainty. Some may indicate construction phases, while others may reflect simple utilitarian use. You trace the air near it without touching. Then you move on. The staircase continues downward again, and with each step, the sense of distance from the upper platform increases. The exposure of the sky feels far away now, replaced by layered stone and internal structure. You realize that the tower is not simply a vertical building. It is a sequence of environments stacked upon one another, each with its own relationship to wind, sound, and time, and you are moving steadily back through them. You continue descending, and the tower begins to feel increasingly familiar again, as if you are moving back through layers you've already understood once but are now experiencing from the reverse side. The staircase curves in its steady spiral, and each step brings a quieter version of the world above you into focus. The air is noticeably denser here, not heavier in a physical sense, but more saturated with traces of use, time, and enclosure. In tall stone structures that have stood for centuries, lower internal zones often retain subtle environmental residues from long periods of occupation. Moisture, smoke particles, and temperature stability all contribute to a feeling of grounded stillness that contrasts sharply with exposed upper levels. You rest one hand against the wall as you descend. The stone is uneven here, marked by variations in texture that suggest multiple phases of construction and repair. Medieval buildings were rarely static creations. They evolved gradually, shaped by necessity, resource availability, and changing functions over time. This layered construction is still visible in many surviving Highland towers, where different masonry techniques can be identified within the same structure. The sound of the storm is faint now, almost distant enough to feel separate from the tower itself, instead of surrounding you. It arrives in softened fragments that slip through the structure in irregular pulses. The deeper you go, the more the building filters external forces into something subdued. You reach a small landing. It is dimly lit, with only faint illumination filtering down from higher openings. The light is pale and diffuse, lacking any strong direction. It drifts across the stone in uneven patches, briefly revealing the contours of the architecture before fading again into shadow. You pause here for a moment. The silence is different from the upper levels. It is not empty, but settled. It feels like a space that has absorbed countless repetitions of similar conditions. Storms passing outside, stillness within. Cycles of human presence and absence layered into the structure. You notice a recessed section in the wall. Inside it, there are faint traces of metal fixtures, possibly once used for hanging lanterns or securing tools in medieval towers associated with rural estates or hunting grounds. Such fittings were commonly distributed across transitional spaces to support movement and function. The exact arrangement would have depended on the needs of the occupants and the changing use of the building over time. You continue downward. The staircase tightens slightly again, wrapping closer to the central core of the tower. The geometry feels more enclosed, more inward-facing. Each step produces a muted echo that fades quickly into the surrounding stone. As you descend, you notice how temperature subtly increases. Not warmth in a modern sense, but a reduction in exposure. The deeper sections of stone retain more stable internal conditions, less affected by direct wind and external atmospheric shifts. This creates a gradual shift in sensory experience that becomes more noticeable the further you move from the upper platform. You reach another corridor. This one is longer and straighter than the spiral sections, suggesting a more functional design. The walls here are smoother in places, with fewer irregularities. That consistency implies either later modification or more careful construction intended for repeated use. You walk slowly forward. A faint scent becomes noticeable again, a mixture of damp stone and residual smoke that has settled into the structure over time. These kinds of century traces are common in older stone buildings, where fireplaces or hearths were used extensively during colder seasons. You pass a series of narrow wall openings. They are smaller here, allowing only limited light and air exchange through one of them. You catch a brief glimpse of the outside world again, though it is heavily obscured by a snowfall. The view is fragmented and fleeting, quickly disappearing as the wind shifts. You continue along the corridor. The architecture subtly changes again, the ceiling lowers slightly, and the space becomes more compact. This kind of variation is often found in multi-level medieval towers where different floors serve distinct purposes. Upper levels were typically more open and exposed, while lower levels prioritize storage, stability, or service functions. You notice another carved recess. This one is deeper than the previous ones, It could have served as a storage niche or a resting point for objects used frequently in this area of the tower. The stone around it is worn smoother than surrounding surfaces, indicating repeated contact over long periods. You slow your pace. The storm outside is now barely perceptible. It is present only as a faint background pressure that occasionally shifts through the structure. Inside, the environment feels more controlled, almost insulated from external variation. You reach a broader chamber. This space is more open than the corridor, with a slightly higher ceiling supported by thick stone arches. The arrangement suggests a transitional function, possibly connecting to vertical areas with storage or lower operational zones. You step into the center. The sound here is minimal, absorbed quickly by the surrounding architecture. The silence feels more complete than in any previous section, not because sound is absent, but because it is contained. You notice faint markings on the floor. They form irregular patterns, possibly created by repeated movement of heavy objects over time in archaeological studies of similar structures. Such wear patterns are often interpreted as evidence of long-term functional use. Though exact meanings can vary depending on context, you stand still for a moment. The sense of depth within the tower becomes more apparent here. It is not just vertical distance, but layered accumulation of spaces that have served different roles across time. Each level carries its own environmental character, shaped by exposure, construction, and use. You continue forward. A narrow passage leads deeper again, and the air becomes slightly cooler. The transition is subtle but noticeable, suggesting proximity to lower storage areas or sections less frequently heated or occupied. You move carefully through it. The walls feel closer again, and the lighting dims further. Only faint reflected light from higher openings reaches this level, creating soft gradients across the stone surfaces. You pass another small opening. Snow is still visible outside, but it appears more distant now, both physically and perceptually. The storm feels like something happening above layers of separation rather than something immediately interacting with your surroundings. You continue. The corridor bends gently, guiding you toward what feels like one of the lowest internal sections of the tower. The stone here is thick, stubble, and unyielding. It carries a sense of permanence that contrasts with the fluid motion of wind and snow outside. You realize you are nearing the deeper core once again, and the tower continues to hold its structure around you, unchanged and enduring. You move deeper into the lower reaches of the tower, and the architecture begins to feel increasingly grounded, as if the structure is settling back into the earth rather than rising away from it. The corridor narrows slightly, then widens again in a slow rhythm that suggests layers of construction adjusted over time rather than a single unified design. The air here is noticeably more stable. It does not fluctuate with the same sensitivity as the upper levels. Instead, it holds a consistent coolness, the kind that stone develops when it has been insulated from direct wind for long periods. In many medieval Highland towers, these lower sections functioned as storage zones or service areas precisely because they maintained more predictable environmental conditions. You walk slowly, your footsteps now producing only faint echoes that dissipate quickly into the walls. The sound of the storm outside is almost gone, not absent, but reduced to a distant suggestion, as if it belongs to another layer of reality entirely separate from where you are now. This separation is not absolute, but it is enough to make the interior feel self-contained again. You notice a series of structural changes in the stonework. The blocks here are larger and less refined than those in the upper sections. Their surfaces are rougher, with deeper joints between them. This kind of masonry is often associated with earlier phases of construction or with areas built primarily for strength rather than appearance. In fortified medieval architecture, especially in exposed regions like the Highlands, durability was often prioritized over uniform finish. You place your hand briefly against the wall, The stone feels dense and unyielding, almost heavy in its presence. It does not respond to external conditions in the same way the upper levels did. Instead, it feels like a foundational element, something designed to absorb force rather than reflect it. You continue forward. The corridor bends gently, leading you into a wider transitional space. The ceiling here is higher again, supported by thick stone arches that distribute weight across the structure above. These architectural features are common in medieval towers, where vertical load management was essential for long-term stability. You pause in the centre of the space. There is a faint stillness here that feels different from the upper silence. It is not quietness created by distance from the storm alone, but a kind of internal equilibrium where the structure and its environment seem balanced. You notice recessed openings along the wall. They are deeper here, more functional in appearance. Some appear to have held wooden beams or storage elements that are no longer present. In medieval towers, lower chambers were often used for storing supplies, tools, and provisions needed for both daily life and extended periods of isolation during harsh weather. You move closer to one of the recesses. Inside, the stone is smoother than the surrounding surface, suggesting repeated contact over time. The edges are slightly rounded, shaped not by intention but by long use. These subtle physical traces often provide more information about historical activity than written records alone. You step back and continue. The passage narrows again, guiding you towards another interior chamber. The lighting becomes dimmer, relying almost entirely on faint reflections filtering down from higher openings. The illumination is soft and unstable, shifting with every movement of air through the structure. You notice a faint draft. It moves through the corridor in slow pulses, not strong enough to be disruptive, but present enough to remind you that even the deepest parts of the tower are still connected to the outside environment. Wind does not disappear here. It simply becomes diffused and delayed. You reach another chamber. This one is larger and more enclosed, with a low vaulted ceiling supported by heavy arches. The space feels deliberately constructed for stability and long-term use rather than temporary occupation. The floor is uneven but solid, shaped by centuries of subtle settling. You step inside fully. The sound changes immediately. Your footsteps are absorbed more completely here, leaving only faint residual echoes that fade almost instantly. The chamber feels acoustically dense, as if sound is being absorbed by the stone rather than reflected. You notice markings on the floor. They are irregular and shallow, possibly created by repeated movement of objects over time. In archaeological studies of medieval structures, such wear patterns are often interpreted as indicators of functional activity zones, though their precise meanings can vary depending on context and preservation. You move toward the center of the chamber. There is a faint sense of containment here, not in a restrictive way, but in the sense that the space has been shaped for sustained use. It feels less like a passage and more like a place where activities once occurred repeatedly over long periods. You glance toward the walls. There are faint traces of soot near the upper edges, suggesting the presence of fire or smoke at some point in the structure's history. In medieval towers, even lower storage areas occasionally contained hearths or heating elements, especially in regions with harsh winters. You pause again. The silence here is deeper than in any previous section. It is not empty, but layered, built from accumulated stillness and long periods of minimal disturbance. You notice a narrow opening in one wall. It is small and angled, allowing only a limited view of the outside world through it. You can see only faint movement of snow, reduced to soft drifting shapes that pass quickly across the frame. You approach it briefly. The cold air near the opening is more noticeable, but still muted compared to the upper levels. The difference in exposure between this chamber and the tower's top is now fully apparent. It feels like two entirely separate environments connected by the same structure. You step away from the opening A subtle sound draws your attention deeper into the chamber. It is not distinct, but it carries a faint irregularity that stands out against the otherwise steady silence. It could be wind interacting with internal gaps, or it could be the natural settling of stone responding to long-term temperature shifts. You listen for a moment. The sound does not repeat in a predictable way, and then it fades again into stillness. You continue walking. A second passage leads further inward, slightly lower than the chamber you are in now. The transition is gradual rather than abrupt, suggesting that the tower's internal layout was designed with continuous movement in mind rather than rigid separation. You follow it. The walls become closer again, and the air grows slightly more humid. This change is subtle but consistent with lower interior zones, where moisture tends to accumulate more easily due to reduced airflow and proximity to ground level. You notice another recessed niche. It is empty, but its shape suggests repeated use for storage or placement of small objects. The edges are worn smooth, indicating long-term interaction rather than short-term function. You slow your pace. The storm outside is now almost entirely absent from perception. It exists only as a faint pressure far above, filtered through multiple layers of stone and distance. You realize that you are now deep within the most stable part of the tower. Here, the structure feels less like a shelter from the storm and more like a foundation built around permanence itself, and the tower continues to hold its quiet form around you. You continue deeper into the lowest accessible part of the tower, and the atmosphere shifts once more. Though this time the change is so gradual it feels almost like a memory unfolding rather than a physical transition. The corridor narrows slightly, then opens into a more grounded passage where the stone feels older, heavier, and more directly tied to the earth beneath the structure. The air is steady here, not still in an absolute sense, but consistent enough that you begin to notice the absence of fluctuation rather than the presence of movement. In many medieval stone towers built in exposed northern regions, the lowest levels often maintain the most stable internal conditions, buffered by the sheer mass of stone above and around them. You walk forward slowly, and your footsteps now produce only muted contact sounds. The storm outside has become almost entirely abstract. It is no longer a force you feel directly. Instead, it exists as a distant environmental condition that the tower is continuously filtering into insignificance. This layered separation between exterior and interior is one of the defining characteristics of long-enduring stone architecture. You notice the stonework again as you move. It's rougher here than anywhere else in the tower. The blocks are larger, less refined, and fitted together with functional precision rather than aesthetic concern. This kind of construction is often associated with foundational phases of medieval towers, where strength and stability were prioritized over visual refinement. You place your hand against the wall. The surface is cold but stable, carrying no sense of fluctuation. It feels deeply anchored, as if it extends far beyond what you can perceive, into the ground and beyond the visible structure of the tower itself. You continue along the passage. The corridor begins to widen slightly, opening into a low chamber that feels more utilitarian than the spaces above. The ceiling is supported by thick arches that distribute weight evenly across the structure, a design commonly used in medieval architecture to reinforce lower levels against the cumulative load of upper floors. You step inside. The sound changes immediately. Your movement becomes more absorbed here, as if the chamber is designed to contain sound rather than reflect it. The silence is not empty, but dense, layered in a way that makes each small noise feel carefully placed rather than scattered. You notice shallow recesses in the walls. They are irregular in shape and spacing, suggesting repeated functional use rather than standardized design. In historical structures of this kind, lower chambers often served multiple overlapping purposes depending on the needs of the household or estate, including storage of supplies, equipment maintenance, or seasonal preparation. You move closer to one of the recesses. Inside, the stone is smoother than the surrounding wall. The edges have been softened by the long-term interaction, though the exact source of that contact is no longer visible. Such wear patterns often accumulate slowly over centuries, leaving behind only subtle physical evidence of repeated activity. You step back and continue forward. The chamber leads into another passage, slightly lower and more enclosed. The transition is gradual, with no clear boundary between one space and the next. This kind of fluid architectural design is common in older medieval structures that evolved over time rather than being constructed as fully planned units. You notice a faint change in temperature. It becomes slightly cooler again, not dramatically, but enough to suggest proximity to deeper sections of the tower's foundation. In stone buildings, temperature often stabilizes at lower levels due to reduced exposure and increased insulation from surrounding earth. You pause briefly. The silence here feels complete in a different way than the upper levels. It is not shaped by distance from the storm, but by structural depth. The tower no longer feels like it is filtering weather. It feels like it is holding stillness. You continue walking. The corridor bends gently, revealing another chamber ahead. This one is lower and more enclosed, with a thick vaulted ceiling that presses down visually without feeling oppressive. The space feels designed for endurance rather than activity. You step inside. The floor is uneven but solid, showing faint signs of long-term use. There are subtle depressions in the stone that may have been created by repeated placement of heavy objects. In medieval architecture, lower chambers like this were often used for storage of goods that required cool, stable conditions. You walk slowly across the chamber. The sound of your movement is minimal, absorbed quickly by the surrounding stone. Even your breathing feels quieter here, as if the space is reducing unnecessary resonance. You notice a narrow opening in one wall. It is small and angled, allowing only a limited view of the outside through it. You can see faint movement of snow, though it is heavily blurred by distance and obstruction. The storm is now almost entirely separated from your immediate perception. You approach the opening. Cold air is present here, but it is faint, diluted by the thickness of the surrounding stone. The contrast between this chamber and the upper platform you stood on earlier feels increasingly pronounced, as if you are moving through entirely different environmental systems within the same structure. You step away again. A faint sound draws your attention from deeper within the chamber. It is not distinct, but it carries a subtle irregularity that stands out against the otherwise stable silence. It could be airflow moving through hidden gaps in the stone, or it could be structural settling occurring slowly over time. You listen for a moment. The sound does not repeat in a predictable pattern, and then it fades again into stillness. You continue forward. Another passage opens ahead, slightly lower and narrower. The transition is smooth, suggesting that the tower's internal layout was designed for continuous movement rather than sharply separated zones. You follow it. The walls become closer again, and the air takes on a faint humidity. This change is subtle but noticeable, consistent with lower interior sections where airflow is more restricted and moisture tends to accumulate over long periods. You notice another recessed niche. It is empty, but its edges are worn smooth. This suggests repeated use over long periods, though the exact function is no longer clear. In medieval structures, such features were often multifunctional, adapting to changing needs over time. You slow your pace. The storm outside is now barely perceptible. It exists only as a distant atmospheric condition, no longer directly interacting with your surroundings. You realize that you are now within one of the most stable regions of the tower. Here, everything feels anchored, not just physically, but experientially. The structure no longer feels like a response to the environment. It feels like a fixed point within it. You continue forward into deeper stillness. You move further into the lowest accessible reaches of the Falcon Tower, and the structure feels increasingly like it is settling into its most grounded state. The passages here are narrower, but not in a restrictive way. Instead, they feel compact, as if every part of the tower above has gradually compressed the space beneath into something more stable and enduring. The air is calm in a way that is almost complete. There is no noticeable fluctuation from the storm outside anymore. Instead, there is a consistent coolness that belongs entirely to the stone itself. In medieval stone constructions built in exposed highland environments, lower interior zones often maintain this kind of steady internal climate due to insulation from thick masonry and reduced direct exposure to wind. You continue walking slowly. Your footsteps produce a muted rhythm that disappears almost immediately into the walls. The sound does not travel far here. It is absorbed, contained, and softened by the density of the surrounding structure. The corridor widens slightly, opening into a chamber that feels more foundational than functional. The ceiling is low, supported by thick stone arches that distribute the weight of the tower above in carefully balanced lines. This kind of structural design was essential in medieval construction, especially in multi-level towers where vertical load had to be managed continuously over centuries of use and repair. You pause in the centre of the chamber. The silence feels different here. It is not absence, but compression. Every sound that enters this space seems to be reduced before it fully forms. Even your breathing feels quieter, as if the chamber is moderating your presence within it. You look around. The stone is rough and deeply worn in places, not polished, not shaped for appearance, but formed through long interaction with use and environment. Some sections show subtle variations in colour and texture, suggesting repairs or replacements made at different times in the tower's history. In many surviving Highland structures, such layering of materials reflects centuries of adaptation rather than a single construction phase. You step toward one of the walls. There is a recessed section carved into the stone. It is shallow but deliberate in shape. The edges are smoother than the surrounding surface, indicating repeated contact over long periods. The exact purpose is not immediately clear, though similar features in medieval towers have been associated with storage. Utility placement or structural adjustments. You trace the air just above it. The stone feels colder here, though the difference is subtle. Temperature variation at this depth is minimal, yet the sensation of cold is still shaped by proximity to external weather systems above, which continue to exert indirect influence through the structure. You move away and continue forward. Another passage opens from the chamber, slightly lower and narrower than the one you entered through. The transition is gradual, with no clear boundary between spaces. This fluidity is characteristic of older medieval buildings where architectural evolution occurred incrementally over time, rather than through single-plan designs. As you proceed, the walls begin to feel closer again. The stone is more uniform here, with fewer visible irregularities. This suggests either a more stable construction phase or an area that has been less frequently altered over time. In many medieval towers, lower internal sections often reflect earlier building techniques that prioritize structural integrity over decorative consistency. You notice a faint change in sound. Not the storm, which is now almost entirely absent from perception, but a subtle internal resonance. It is low and irregular, likely caused by airflow moving through unseen gaps within the stonework. In tall stone structures, even the most stable sections can produce these kinds of microacoustic effects due to temperature and pressure differences between internal zones. You slow your pace. The passage bends gently, leading you into another enclosed chamber. This one is slightly larger, with a vaulted ceiling that arches overhead in thick, rounded forms. The architecture here feels intentionally reinforced, suggesting it was designed to support sustained structural load rather than temporary use. You step inside. The sound of your movement is almost completely absorbed. There is no echo, only a faint residual impression of motion that fades quickly. The chamber feels acoustically dense, as if it is designed to contain rather than reflect. You notice faint markings along the floor. They are irregular and shallow, possibly formed by repeated movement of heavy objects over long periods. In archaeological studies of medieval buildings, such wear patterns are often used to reconstruct movement pathways and functional zones within structures, though their exact origins are not always certain. You stand still for a moment. The sense of depth within the tower becomes more pronounced here. It is not vertical distance alone, but layered accumulation. Each level above has left subtle influence on the spaces below, not physically altering them, but shaping how they are experienced. You turn slightly. A narrow opening is visible along one wall. It is small and angled, allowing only limited visibility of the outside environment. Through it, the snowfall appears distant and fragmented, reduced to faint drifting motion that barely registers as movement. You approach it briefly. Cold air is present near the opening, but it is heavily muted by the thickness of the surrounding stone. The contrast between interior stability and exterior motion is now almost absolute. You step back. A faint sound emerges again from deeper within the structure. It is not distinct, but it carries a subtle irregularity that draws attention because of its contrast with the surrounding silence. It could be airflow shifting through internal channels, or structural settling occurring at a very slow rate. You listen for a moment. The sound does not repeat in a predictable cycle. It appears once, then fades. Leaving only stillness behind, you continue forward. The passage narrows again, guiding you toward what feels like one of the deepest internal sections of the tower. The air grows slightly more humid, consistent with lower zones where ventilation is reduced and moisture retention is higher. You notice another recessed niche. It is empty, but its surface is smoother than surrounding stone, indicating repeated long-term use. In medieval towers, such features were often adapted for multiple purposes depending on need, evolving over time rather than remaining fixed in function. You move past it. The storm outside is now entirely distant, reduced to a conceptual presence rather than a sensory one's. It no longer interacts with your immediate environment. You realize that you are now within the most stable interior layer of the tower. Here, everything feels anchored. The structure no longer behaves like a barrier against weather. It feels like a self-contained environment shaped by centuries of continuity. You continue deeper into the quiet. You move into the deepest accessible part of the Falcon Tower, and the atmosphere changes in a way that feels less like transition and more like arrival. The passage narrows one final time before opening into a low chamber that sits close to the foundation of the structure. The stone here feels older than everything above it, not in a literal sense of age alone, but in the weight of accumulated presence. The air is completely still now. There is no trace of the storm that once dominated the upper platform. No wind, no fragmented sound, no pressure shifts moving through slits or corridors. What remains is a steady, enclosed quiet that feels held in place by the sheer mass of the tower above. You step forward slowly. Your footsteps are almost entirely absorbed by the stone. Even the smallest movement feels softened, as if the chamber is designed to contain not just sound, but intention. In many medieval stone structures, the lowest internal levels were often the most stable, used for storage or foundational support, where environmental variation was minimal and conditions remained consistent throughout the year. You pause in the center of the chamber. The ceiling is low, supported by thick arches that distribute the weight of the entire tower above you. Each curve of stone is part of a larger structural logic that has carried centuries of storms, wind pressure, and seasonal change without collapse. The engineering behind such endurance is not immediately visible, but it is present in every aligned joint and carefully balanced span. You look around slowly. The walls are rough and unadorned here. There is no attempt at decoration or refinement. Instead, everything is functional, shaped by necessity rather than appearance. This kind of foundational construction reflects a medieval priority that placed structural endurance above visual presentation, especially in remote highland environments where weather conditions demanded reliability above all else. You notice faint irregularities in the stone surface. Some areas are smoother, others more jagged, suggesting repairs or modifications made at different points in time, over centuries. Structures like this often absorbed changes gradually, with each generation leaving subtle marks of maintenance, adaptation, or reinforcement. You move closer to one wall. There is a shallow recess carved into it, deeper than the others you have seen earlier in the tower. Its shape is simple, almost utilitarian, but the surrounding stone is worn in a way that suggests long-term interaction. The exact purpose is not immediately clear, though similar features in medieval towers are sometimes associated with storage, anchoring points, or structural adjustments made during construction phases. You run your hand just above it. The surface feels colder here, not because of external weather, but because of its position deep within the stone mass. Temperature stability is highest at this depth, but so is the sensation of accumulated cold retained over long periods. You step back again. The chamber remains silent, but it is not empty. It feels filled with continuity, as if every layer of the tower above has compressed its history downward into this final space. You notice a narrow opening near the floor. It is small and angled, offering only a faint glimpse of the outside world through it. There is no clear view, only a suggestion of movement in pale tones. The storm is no longer visible as a force. It exists only as distant atmospheric variation beyond the structure. You approach it briefly. Cold air is present near the opening, but it is faint and diluted. The contrast between this deep interior and the exposed upper platform you stood on earlier feels almost unimaginable now, as if the two spaces belong to entirely separate environments. You step away. A subtle awareness settles over the chamber. Not sound, not movement, but a kind of structural stillness that feels complete. It is the absence of change rather than the absence of presence. Everything here is held in equilibrium by the weight and design of the tower itself. You notice faint markings along the floor. They are irregular, shallow impressions that may have formed through repeated placement of heavy objects over long periods. In archaeological studies of medieval buildings, such traces are often used to infer patterns of use in spaces where written records do not survive. They are silent records embedded in the material itself. You remain still for a moment longer. The sense of descent is no longer physical. There is nowhere further to go. The tower has reached its most grounded point, both structurally and experientially. You think back briefly to the upper platform, the exposure, the wind, the shifting landscape, the sensation of standing at the boundary between structure and sky. That version of the tower feels distant now, not in time, but in character, as if it belonged to a different interpretation of the same place. Here, everything is condensed. No wind, no fragmentation, no external negotiation, only stone, stillness, and continuity. You take a slow breath. Even that feels absorbed into the chamber, becoming part of its quiet structure rather than something separate from it. In some interpretations of medieval tower architecture, the lowest levels were not merely functional foundations, but symbolic anchors of permanence, representing stability beneath layers of human activity and environmental change. Such readings vary widely, and surviving evidence is limited, but the physical experience of spaces like this often invites that kind of reflection. You turn slightly and look around one final time. The chamber remains unchanged. The tower has completed its sequence, From exposed platform to deepest interior, from storm to stillness, from sky to stone. And now there is only rest. The structure continues to stand around you, holding its long memory of weather. Falcons, footsteps, and silence. Nothing moves, nothing needs to. And in the deepest part of the tower, where everything finally settles into quiet permanence, the tower is still with you now, even as everything begins to soften. Not the stone itself, but the feeling of it. The sense of layered quiet that seemed to gather in every corridor and chamber you passed through. It lingers like warmth left in fabric after a long night, fading slowly but not all at once. In your mind, the storm is no longer something outside a building. It feels more like a distant memory of movement, something that once pressed against walls and openings, but has now drifted away into something gentler. The Falcon Tower stands in that memory too, no longer as a structure of stone and defence, but as a vertical path through different kinds of silence. You might notice your thoughts beginning to slow here, not because anything is being forced, but because there is nothing left to chase. The upper platform, the narrow corridors, the dim chambers below, they all begin to settle into one continuous impression rather than separate spaces. Height and depth lose their sharp edges. There is a quiet comfort in that fading. The idea that places like this continue existing even when they are no longer being observed. That stone holds its own kind of patience, shaped by centuries of weather and stillness, by falcons once carried through wind, by footsteps that are no longer echoing. Breathing feels easier now, more regular. The story does not end abruptly, it simply becomes less defined, like snowfall thinning in the distance. You do not need to follow anything further. There is nowhere else you are required to go. Just rest in that final sense of stillness. Let it settle around you without effort. The tower remains, but only as a gentle outline now. And even that begins to fade at the edges, and everything becomes quiet. Sweet dreams.